gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is October the 2nd, 2022, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, and all the business. Without further ado, I will join in the chat with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Pretty solid, pretty good. What about yourself?
Well, can't complain.
Yeah. Is it cooling off there at all yet?
Oh, a little bit.
A
bit. I spend most of my time inside anyway, so kind of a moot point one way or the other.
Fair enough. Texas, the great state of air conditioner boom.
Oh, yeah. Wouldn't be livable any other way, pretty much.
Yep. I recall it. You get that temperature shock as well if you are outside in the heat. You go from your cool car that's air conditioned into the blistering heat for a little bit and then back into another cold blast of AC turned up.
Yep. Yeah, it's not a fun trip.
Yeah. Meanwhile, here in Seattle, we have our windows open and stuff, and I can hardly hear myself think because of the fucking birds being so loud. They're pretty noisy. They're in a good mood, I guess. It's cooling off now. Starting to be fall. We have the leaves on the trees still, but they're just now starting to turn color. So yeah, the main stuff that I saw this week that was newsworthy, maybe world discussion worthy, was the Iran protests and stuff rage on. Do you have any updates for us on that one?
Oh, no changes, really. The protests are ongoing. The death toll has been rising, although I don't think it's really spiked all that much. The Iranian government is starting to send some signals that it might crack down, but mostly it's been more threats than anything concrete. So status quo, pretty much. It remains to be seen just what the government will actually do about it, or if the protest will be able to maintain momentum. They seem to be thus far, but who knows how long that'll last.
Have they boiled down the protesting to some action items they want overturned? You mentioned the surveillance for hijab sort of thing that was proposed.
Yeah, that's the main thing as I understand it, but I haven't read anything to suggest that the protests are really organized as of yet, such that there's any single set of items that any representatives of the protests are demanding from the government as of yet. So in general, from what I've read, it's more opposition to the changes to the hijab rules, outrage over the death of the young woman, and also, to a degree, just discontent with the government generally. People will take the opportunity to express that when it arises, as it is now. So a lot of protesting and chanting, but a lot of the energy doesn't really seem all that directed as of yet. Such that we can say that there's any particular set of demands that have been presented to the government that it could make concessions to in order to assuage the protesters. It is assuage, right? I think I pronounced that wrong last time. Somebody corrected me in chat.
Assuage. Let's see. Pronunciation, tell us.
Assuage.
Assuage.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, that was that was a thing that I noticed with the Occupy protests, is anytime there's a protest event, you'll have lots of different people who are not content about various issues, not necessarily the main one that sparked the protest overall, but they'll also come out and they sort of bolster the overall size of the protest, but sometimes they can confuse the message if they're being loud about their issue and people are trying to figure out, okay, what are these protesters trying to get done? And you hear a bunch of different reasons, but it seems like for this one there is at least a clear catalyst for all of it, so they know where the protests are starting from. But has Iran had pretty low approval of their government for a while now?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
I mean, technically, they do have some democratic institutions, but in practice, most of the opposition candidates, at this point, pretty much all of the opposition candidates are filtered out during the vetting process. They have a council called the Guardian Council, which is specifically tasked with vetting all people who want to run for office. And, it's always been relatively restrictive, such that generally the biggest opponents of the regime or the most staunch opponents of the regime are filtered out and not allowed to run. But before, in the 80s, 90s, and part of the aughts, you could still find candidates who were being allowed to run who were relatively critical of the government. They were still, pro-revolution, that is to say, pro-Islamic revolution and pro-Ayatollah, but there were factions within that group that are, more reformist or more reactionary. And you saw representation of both for a long time. But then over the past 10, 15 some years, they've started to really close the door even on the reformist faction of the pro-government side of things, so such that you don't really see them anymore. So that's significantly narrowed the field to the point where it is effectively a fully authoritarian state at this point. So that's resulted in a lot of people lacking representation in government, and that's correlated with a decline in legitimacy of the state. So I don't want to oversell it too much. There are a lot of people for whom, the Islamist government is legitimate and they like what it does, they like its policies, etc. So for those people, they don't have as much of a problem. And that does comprise a pretty decent chunk of the country, especially like rural areas and whatnot. But beyond that, there's just ongoing issues that, I mean, besides just the lack of representation, the state of the economy is very bad. And so that even amongst people who might otherwise support the regime, that really rubs them the wrong way. A lack of opportunities will kind of impact everybody regardless of their interest in politics. And so that draws in criticism from people who might otherwise either support the government or who would not otherwise be involved in politics at all. The people who don't care about politics are pretty much always the largest political faction in most countries. Most people would rather only get involved unless they have a direct stake or if there's some kind of emergency. But beyond that, most people are pretty content to just kind of let it run its course, basically. Unfortunately so. But given economic conditions, there's a lot of people who are correspondingly drawn into politics, because they see the government failing to deliver sufficient opportunities for people to kind of progress, in life, to move up the social ladder, to provide for themselves, their families, their children, etc. So that's also caused problems. And I think from what I've read, there's some people, I don't know that it's a large part of Iranians' political body, its body politic, rather. But there are people who don't like Iran's foreign policy. They don't like the idea that what limited funds the Iranian government still has access to see a disproportionate share going to these little adventures overseas, places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, what have you. So there are some people who are pretty critical of that. They would rather that money be spent in Iran and would rather there be some kind of negotiated settlement with the West rather than this sort of perpetual confrontation that the more reactionary conservatives in Iran prefer.
So Iran is currently pretty interventionist with their, at least local foreign policy.
Yeah, they have a heavily regionalist policy. The Iranians, even before the revolution, kind of saw them as natural regional hegemons, or at least regional leaders, because they were easily one of the largest countries in the region, and I think they had the largest economy for a long time. It was a major oil producer, but it also had a lot of people, so that was kind of an unusual combination in the Middle East. Turkey had a lot of people, but it didn't have oil revenue, and its economy was still developing, and well, I guess still is. So they didn't have nearly as many resources as Iran had. But then Saudi Arabia had the resources, they had the oil money, but not the population. So Iran rather, had a sort of a sweet spot, And they also had the benefit of having a government that was relatively decent at investing the money. such that Iran was relatively more developed than other countries in the Middle East. That's not to say it didn't have its problems. Obviously it was not sufficient development to avoid a revolution, in the late 70s. But it was still better off, relatively speaking, than neighboring states, which kind of failed to sufficiently invest in human capital to a degree that could really progress them in a way that would be familiar to Westerners. Certainly, the capital saw some of that in certain countries, but Iran saw relatively more broad-based, not just Tehran, but also some of the other provincial capitals and whatnot. Was not sufficient to prevent an Islamist takeover when the revolution did happen. Still lots of conservatives in rural Iran. And to a degree, there was a lot of factionalism, too, that kind of prevented any kind of real counterweight from forming. Lots of disagreements about what a post-Shah Iran should look like. So that created room for the Islamists to maneuver, so to speak. But yeah, that's kind of another conversation. The point is that, yeah, Iran saw itself as the regional hegemon, and it had a disproportionate development and a disproportionately large military to kind of back up that claim. Even during the Cold War, when Iran was allied with the United States, they still had kind of shaky relations with Saudi Arabia, which nominally was also an American ally. And the reason was that they had sort of little border disputes and disagreements about the way that Mecca and Medina were run, and just in general, they kind of butted heads on what to do with the region and its various issues. So after the revolution, Iran became much more paranoid, about the United States, and it took opportunities where it could to support rebellions or militias or sectarian groups of one kind or another to try to prop them up as counterweights to what were perceived as pro-Western elements in the region. So supporting Syria was an easy layup. Syria was kind of more pro-Soviet anyway. So it didn't have very good relations with the West. And so they took the opportunity to kind of back them from, I think, starting in like the 80s or so. Mm-hmm. And then they also took the opportunity to kind of support, what were they called? They were the Shiite group in Lebanon. Basically, they formed a militia in southern Lebanon called Hezbollah to fight against the Israelis. The Israelis and the Syrians both intervened in Lebanon during its civil war, which started in 1975 and ran until, what was it, like 1990 or so. And Israel basically occupied the southern half of Lebanon, while Syria effectively occupied the northern half, roughly speaking. So the southern half is where more of the Shia population was located, and so the group they formed to fight back against the occupation was called Hezbollah. And Iran, because it was fairly anti-Israeli / anti-Zionist in its foreign policy objectives, took the opportunity to prop up Hezbollah against what was seen as an American puppet, that being Israel. And that relationship has continued into the present day, to the point where Hezbollah is actually more powerful, probably, than the Lebanese army. The Hezbollah just gets a lot more aid and support and has a lot more experience. And probably the biggest example now is Iraq. After 2003, when Saddam Hussein's government was overthrown, there was a number of exiles, Shia political exiles who had been born in Iraq but left because of Saddam Hussein's repression. They had been in exile in Iran. And after the government fell, they moved back in, and they obviously have relatively close ties to the Iranian government. And they've been a vector for Iranian influence in Iraq ever since. The Iranians have also supported militias of one sort or another in Iraq since then, who have been, to varying degrees, either a political force in so much as they engage in politics and run for office and whatnot, and also provide benefits, to people who vote for them. But at the same time, they're also a military force. They have waged war effectively against, either the government or rival militias or, the United States, as the case may be, depending on circumstances, in order to assert their dominance within whatever region they're fighting in. So there's been a good deal of Iranian subterfuge in the region as far as supporting this, that, or the other group or government, as the case may be. Mm-hmm. But they've kept it relatively focused to those three countries, I think. I don't know how involved they'd been in Afghanistan, for example, or how involved they even could be, given how conservative the Taliban is. The Taliban are very much a Sunni Islamist organization, and the most radical Sunni Islamists really do not get along with Shia Islamists. They kind of see them as being borderline apostates.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of creates some friction. It's a little hard to coordinate with people who think you're, ungodly abomination, an affront to God, effectively. Negotiations can be somewhat fraught, and the result is very little cooperation as a result. So I don't know how involved the Iranians were there. And I don't think they're that involved in Pakistan. If anything, they cooperate with Pakistan over the Baluchis, because there's this ethnic group in southwestern Pakistan and southeastern Iran called the Baluchis. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but that's how it's spelled anyway. And they've been effectively fighting for independence for a couple decades now. And the Pakistani government and the Iranian government have had to fight manifestations of that independence movement in their respective territories since that movement began. So probably Iran doesn't intervene that much in Pakistani affairs. They're probably more interested in cooperating on the common Baluchi threat to their territorial integrity. They could be active in Central Asia, but I don't think they are. There is sort of historical room to maneuver there, because historically Central Asia was pretty heavily influenced by Persian culture. But that was also a pretty long time ago. That was the heyday of Persian influence was like a couple thousand years ago. So it's been a hot minute since then.
Yeah, that would have been before Islam and the expansion of the caliphates and stuff.
Well, even after, really, to be fair, even after the sort of the rise of Islam in the region, Persian influence was still pretty heavy. In fact, I would go even further and say that Persian influence was a heavy influence on Islam itself, broadly speaking. A lot of the intellectual tradition, the architecture, the administrative states that were created, a lot of those were heavily Persian, if not outright Persian in origin. And that influence spread pretty far and wide throughout the Islamic world, as a result. So, I would say probably the Russian influence is kind of what more superseded it, which is, relatively more recent. There was probably a long, slow decline even before that of Persian influence. There was probably some, competition with Turkish influence to a degree, but certainly Russian influence superseded it in the 19th century. Because by then the Russians were moving in mass, taking over the local kingdoms. I guess they wouldn't have been kingdoms, sultanates or whatever they were. And sort of overlaying new Russian institutions over the top of the pre-existing status quo. Modern administrative states, secular governments, judicial systems, nominal representative governance, in the form of local councils and stuff. So all of that, as far as I know anyway, was largely introduced by Russians. And those institutions, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have continued to be pretty dominant in those societies, to the point where elites in Central Asia, even to this day, largely still speak Russian, either as a secondary language or even as a first language. Because if you were educated in the Soviet Union, that invariably meant that you were educated in Russian. It kind of varied from era to era. I think earlier in the Soviet Union's history, they were better about educating people in local languages, but I think they were also taught how to speak Russian at least. And if you went to university, I think invariably the classes were taught in Russian. So certainly if you were going to be an elite of any kind, political, economic, or otherwise, you almost invariably went to college at some point. And so that meant that you probably largely conversed with other elites in Russian. So that's a tradition that's continued since then. And it's not even just the language. Russian culture to a degree continues to have a heavy influence there in the form of things like social media, for example. I think VKontakte, which is like the Russian Facebook, basically, still has a very strong presence in Central Asia. And Russian media in general is still pretty heavily consumed in a lot of the urban culture in Central Asia by the more well-off middle class, for example. So it's kind of like, French and French culture in West Africa, for example, which was heavily colonized by the French back in the day, or maybe English influence in South Asia, kind of the same deal, effectively. There's lots of residual cultural influence from the era of colonization.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, given the historical Persian influence, there are still some similarities between Central Asian culture and Persian culture, particularly in terms of like aesthetics, symbols. There are probably still some loan words left over in the local Turkish languages, certainly in the form of Islam and Islamic influences. And in so much as there has been a resurgence of local indigenous culture since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you could say that there's more room for Iranian interference and influence in the region, given that there's less in common, relatively speaking, now between Central Asian states, peoples, and cultures, and Russia and Russian culture now than there was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But to bring this tangent full circle, that hasn't really happened. Iran doesn't seem that interested in the region. Maybe they just don't have the resources for it, or maybe Russian influence is still too strong. Certainly, the Russian government still goes out of its way to try to maintain that area in its sphere of influence, although to kind of mixed results. Basically, all of the states large enough to be semi-independent are relatively skeptical and resistant to Russian influence. Russian influence is probably the most impactful in the smallest, least developed Central Asian states, specifically Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Those states are disproportionately dependent on workers leaving to work in Russia and then sending remittances back to their families in their home countries. So that gives the Russian government a lot more influence over those two smaller states than over the bigger states. And correspondingly, there's a larger Russian military presence there, and the states there are more deferential to Russian diplomatic preferences. But if you look at a country like Kazakhstan, for example, which is not quite an energy power per se, but it's a large enough energy exporter that it can kind of hold its own. They won't go explicitly against Russia, but they will resist Russian entreaties to do stuff that the government doesn't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
We've kind of seen that with the whole Ukraine thing. The Russian government wanted its allies in the region to back it in Ukraine, and a lot of states have not done that. Kazakhstan in particular has been kind of notable for being borderline critical even of the invasion of Ukraine, which kind of surprised me. But that illustrates the degree to which the Kazakh government really does not want to be overly attached and dependent on Russia. It does want to have, at least nominally, its own independent foreign policy. Uzbekistan is similar. They're not really an energy exporter, though. Their thing is just more that Uzbekistan has the largest population of any country in Central Asia other than Russia. I think it's something like 30, 40 million people or something to that effect. And they do export a pretty decent amount of cotton, although I don't think people will like very much how they do that. But it does generate enough money for them to kind of be semi-independent, at least economically, from Russia. So they've been pretty critical of Russia. Well, maybe not critical per se, but they've been pretty focused on balancing dependence on Russia with connectivity with Europe and other actors. They've kind of forged their own path. And then Turkmenistan is just a hermit state. They just don't really associate with much of anybody. Their whole position is that they're neutral and that they don't care about what goes on outside their borders and that they just want to be left alone. They can afford to. They are themselves a decent energy exporter. They don't necessarily export a lot, but they don't really have to because the population is so small. It's kind of like Libya, or at least Libya before Libya imploded anyway. They were not the biggest exporter of oil, but they exported more than enough to have a very high per capita income from that oil revenue. So Turkmenistan is in a similar position. Their population is sufficiently small that even if they don't necessarily export the most amount of oil and natural gas, they're still getting a large enough return to have a lot of money to spend on its own people. I don't know how much of that money they're actually spending on their own people. It's an authoritarian state, and they don't even pretend to have, democratic institutions. Like it's very clearly top down in nature. So a lot of that money is probably taken by the government and by political elites. But regardless, they can pretty well afford to be on their own and isolationist in nature, and everybody seems to respect that for the most part, at least from what I've read and seen thus far. So as a result, between Turkmeni isolationism, Kazakh energy, and Uzbekistan having, a nice mix of large economy with large population, it's only really the two rather smaller states in Central Asia that Russia has the most influence over. And those are the ones they can kind of push around to a degree. So that influence is still pretty large in those two states. So that kind of precludes Iranian influence from really pushing in too much. And then the other states are sufficiently strong that they can kind of deflect any significant effort by Iran to sway or otherwise infiltrate their politics. As a kind of side note, most Central Asian states are ethnically Turkish. They still have a lot of Persian influence historically, but the native languages anyway, are largely Turkish. But with one exception, and which is Tajikistan. Tajikistan, well, ethnic Tajiks anyway, are actually ethnically Persian, and their language is Persian in nature. It's part of the same language family, you might say. So Tajikistan was kind of an outlier in Central Asia. Well, remains an outlier in Central Asia anyway. And so Persian influence there, well, Iranian influence, I should say, in the form of cultural influences particularly strong in Tajikistan. Iranian music, for example, I've read is more popular there, as well as other forms of culture, media, movies, that kind of thing. But even in Tajikistan, the Iranian government doesn't really seem to invest much there. So they seem mostly focused, as a result, on the Middle East. That seems to be the real crux of their foreign policy. And it makes sense too, because, there's growth potential there, you might say, to use business terms. The region is very unstable. So given the instability, there's plenty of room there to kind of wedge in and undermine governments and maybe expand your hold over different polities in the region as you take advantage of various opportunities as they arise. Oh, I didn't mention Yemen. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've talked about the civil war in Yemen before, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so the rebels slash government, depending on how you want to frame them, they're sort of a Shiite group. It's complicated, but effectively they're a Shiite group. So the Iranians have given them support to help them in their war against the Saudis. So that's another country that the Iranians are sort of meddling in, you might say. So yeah, they're relatively interventionist, but to my knowledge, they've never really sent their military, their actual formal military into any of these countries. Mostly it's been special forces, military aid, financial aid, that kind of stuff, but not really an actual deployment of regulars of any sort. So they're pretty circuitous and indirect about it. It is interventionist when you get down to it, but they're more subtle than, say, the United States is normally in its interventions. Yeah, they've kind of got a reputation for that. Persia historically has kind of been known for being pretty good at diplomacy and negotiation. So no surprise that that tradition continues, you might say.
When did Iran get the status of being a sort of axis of evil state relative to the US?
Well, I mean, the phrase axis of evil dates from the Bush administration, the
Okay.
second one, that is to say. So that was the war on terror, where after 9/11, there was some talk about Iran and the United States cooperating, but then about a year or so later, The Bush administration came out and complained that there were certain governments that were supporting terrorist movements in various parts of the world, and these states comprised an axis of evil. So those were Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, if memory serves. And so that was where sort of the term came from. But even before that, Iran was generally perceived as a enemy of the United States and U.S. influence in the Middle East. And that kind of went back to that stemmed from the 1979 revolution, where you had the Shah overthrown and the new Islamist government come in and be very, very paranoid about the intentions of the United States. They saw the United States as an oppressor, an interventionist power that would not leave them alone, that had overthrown a previous government, that being the Abbas, I think it was the Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, I forget his name. He was the president back in the 50s. But the CIA helped overthrow him, and so there was a sense that the United States could simply not be trusted, and that Iran's proper place in the world was as regional hegemon in the Middle East, and that Iran would never achieve its potential or really be secure until U.S. influence had been expunged from the Middle East and Iranian influence established as the dominant influence in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And so that perspective pretty much set Iran on a clear-cut course of confrontation with the United States right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty much been that way ever since. It's kind of waxed and waned in intensity over time. It was probably at its worst in the 1980s, where there was a de facto undeclared war between Iran and the United States. Iran was mostly focused on fighting Iraq in the 1980s. That was the Iran-Iraq War, which was very destructive. But there was also an attempt by the Iranians, I think mostly the Iranian Navy, to limit the ability of the Iraqis to export oil. And the result was that the Iranians attacked a number of oil tankers in the region. And I think it wasn't even just tankers servicing the Iraqis. I think they also went after some Western tankers. I don't recall the details exactly. But the result is that the United States Navy was sent into the Gulf in order to protect shipping. And there was a couple of incidents where, the United States attacked the Iranians, and I think vice versa as well. So it was a very tense situation. It was kind of a semi-undeclared war in the Gulf for a number of years as a result. So, oh, and of course there was the famous hostages. After the revolution happened, the U.S. embassy in Tehran was stormed, and the embassy personnel were held hostage for 2 years, something like that. It was some extended period of time. The Carter administration, Jimmy Carter was president at the time. He was actually largely blamed for the government's inability to respond strongly to the hostage situation, as if not the Islamic Revolution generally. He did at one point greenlight an operation by U.S. Special Forces to try and release those captives. They were going to try to storm the area where they were being held and take them back, by plane or helicopter or whatever, and bring them back to the United States. But the operation, which I think was called Operation Eagle Talon, something like that, that operation turned into a fiasco. There was, I think the operation was basically that special forces would be landed in the desert via C-130 and by CH-53. And from there, they would basically use that forward operating area that they would establish there then to travel further by helicopter to Tehran, capture the hostages, bring them back, and then evacuate everybody by aircraft, by C-130, with the helicopters refueling and then escaping back to carriers waiting nearby in the Gulf. And as it's a pretty ambitious project. That would be pretty ambitious even now, probably. But the result was that during the phase when they were landing in the desert, there was like some dudes in a truck who spotted them and alerted the authorities. So, their cover was blown from very early on. And then even worse, when they were kind of trying to set up this sort of temporary forward operating area, one of the helicopters collided with a C-130. And the C-130 was destroyed. It was rendered inoperable and ended up burning. And so the
C-130
whole
is a plane?
C-130 is a transport plane. It's a four-engine transport. It's medium-sized transport that's been the mainstay of airborne logistics for the U.S. Army and Air Force for a very long time. I think it was first mass-produced in the 60s or something like that, and they're still kicking around. I think they just had the what was it? C-130J is the newest variant, or maybe I'm showing my age. I think that was like the newest variant 10 years ago or something. I don't remember, but yeah, they've been upgrading them for like 50 years or whatever. So yeah, it's medium-sized transport plane that's been around forever.
But we
And
smashed our own helicopter into our own plane.
yeah, that was the accident, and that resulted in the mission being scrapped. And the Iranians delighted in showing footage, of the wreckage and showing how incompetent the Americans were. And the Carter administration took a big political hit. He was blamed for it, and it was just a big mess. Politically, diplomatically, etc. So it went poorly. So that also kind of created some bad blood. People in the United States were upset about it. Not just with the Iranians, but also with the government. And the Iranians were upset. Can it kind of prove to them that the U.S. didn't respect their sovereignty and was kind of out to get them? So it kind of set the tone for the decade, you might say. Yeah, the whole undeclared war in the Gulf actually came later. Later on after that, it was more mid late 80s. In the 90s, it kind of evened out a little. That was more chill. They had a relatively reformist politician leading Iran in the 90s, so relations were pretty quiet for a long time, relatively speaking. They were involved in some shenanigans in like Lebanon and allegedly, possibly some terrorism in South America. Kind of depends on who you want to believe, but relatively quiet. And then the war on terrorism came, the Bush administration. That's kind of subjective too. You could say the Bush administration alienated Iran needlessly, that it would have been smarter to try to engage with them and cooperate on the common threat in the form of, radical jihadis, whom were also a problem for Iran in large part, you
Mm.
know. But you could also argue that Iran was still getting up to shenanigans in the region, that it was still a rival to the United States and never really stopped trying to expunge the region of American influence. So you could say that the Bush administration just sort of reset and re-engaged with what was already a very negative relationship. So I generally think more that it was unnecessary. I think it was kind of a needlessly belligerent. I think maybe the some of the hawks in the Bush administration kind of had the wind in their sails after 9/11 and kind of thought they could do anything and thought that Iran would sort of be the next logical target after Iraq. But that would have required Iraq to go much, much more smoothly than it ended up going.
Mm.
Since it did not, Iran was never really on the table like I think the Hawks wanted it to be. So basically, they ended up alienating Iran for nothing. So relations in the aughts were pretty bad. Not violently bad like they were in the 80s, but still kind of in decline. And that was also the period when Iran really started back up its nuclear program. So that's easily the biggest negative to fall out of the decline in relations in the aughts. Uh, Teens, the 20 teens, basically the past 10 years were, yeah, kind of, they waned wildly. They waxed and waned wildly. Uh, the Obama administration went out of their way to try to negotiate a nuclear deal, almost a little too enthusiastically. And the result was an agreement that was not very effective, but at least nominally addressed the nuclear issue. So Iran kind of sort of drew back on its program with the expectation that there would be sanctions relief both in the present and in the future. But that agreement was always on shaky ground. And then the Trump administration came along and just shot it out of a cannon, basically.
Mm.
So at that point, relations sharply deteriorated, and we had all the shenanigans over the past couple years with, drone strikes by the Iranians in Iraq, vicariously through proxy militias, but still mostly directed by the Iranian special forces, the Quds force. And then, of course, that led to the assassination of Omar Soleimani, the big special forces guy in Iran. And that led to ballistic missiles being used against Americans and Iraqi air bases. It's been a wild ride. It's definitely been a wild ride. It's cooled off a little since the Biden administration took over. But things have only gotten more hairy because during the Trump administration, the Iranians actually had a more dovish president. That was I think his name was Rafsanjani or no, Rouhani. That's what his name was. So he was more dovish, but the stars were just not aligned. We had a more hawkish president, they had a dovish president, and that very rarely works out very well. So now we have a more dovish president in the United States, but the Iranians now have a more hawkish president in the form of, oh hell, what's his name? Niamo or Nieto, whatever it was. I forget his name. But he's not really interested in negotiations. He's mostly been delaying the talks effectively. And it's not entirely clear why, if he's just trying to get the best deal possible, or if he's just waiting so that the Iranian nuclear program can scale up in secret and they can kind of reach a threshold where they can spring for a nuclear weapon over a course of a couple of months. So that remains to be seen. But regardless, they don't seem that interested in the talks that the Biden administration is trying to engage in. So probably a lot of missed opportunities over the past 5 years. If both countries had had hawkish presidents, it might have been easier for one to dominate the other and then eventually reach some kind of accord. Or if both presidents had been dovish, it would have been easier to kind of hammer out some kind of negotiated settlement. But instead, both countries have basically been alternating types of leaders to the detriment of any possibility of a real substantive peace deal or progress of any kind. So yeah, it's not really been in a good place the past 10 years, but still not as bad as the 80s though. But yeah, not great. But to kind of get back to your original question, Iran really has been on bad terms with the United States since 1979, overall, and it's kind of just been consistently so ever since.
Well, that makes sense at least. I guess them backing Hamas in Israel is a regular thorn because the U.S. has tried to have a lot of close relations with Israel.
Yeah, that's partly striking out against the United States, but that's also part of their mission of establishing Iranian hegemony in the region. Part of the way that countries fight for hegemony, try to establish hegemony rather, is by trying to legitimize their hegemony. So the Iranians say that they are protectors of the Palestinians and by extension protectors of Islam. They do for the Palestinians what other Arab states in the region that are either more or less pro-American won't do, which is to say, really provide weapons and support to Palestinian resistance fighters of one sort or another. So that's part of their claim to being a more legitimate regional power than either the United States or, say, the Saudis, who are, probably the alternative claimant there to regional hegemon. It used to be Egypt was also a player there. Egypt used to be kind of the default leader of the Arab world in the Middle East by extension, but that's not really worked out over the past couple decades. Egypt has kind of entered a couple decades ago, Egypt entered a period of decline, economically, as well as in terms of its cultural influence. It used to be the voice for secular pan-Arab nationalism, which was pretty violently authoritarian in a lot of ways, but it at least presented some kind of counterweight to either Islamism, sort of in the form of the Wahhabi school that kind of has a bad reputation for obvious reasons at this point, or sort of absolute monarchy in the form of, say, the Shah of Iran or the Saudi royal family. So it was at least some kind of alternative option, but because it struggled so much economically and with corruption and with failed wars against Israel, which were also very damaging to legitimacy, it's just fallen out of favor. And Egypt now has had so many economic problems that it's heavily dependent on financial aid from the Gulf states. They need financial bailouts of one sort or another from Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, maybe not so much Bahrain, but the Emiratis. There we go. I knew there was another major one I was forgetting. The Saudis and the Emiratis mainly have been giving them a lot of financial aid. That kind of stemmed from partly the 2008 financial crisis, but also the Arab Spring. and also just paranoia about just how committed an ally the United States is. After the Arab Spring, the Egyptian military became very, very skeptical of its alliance with the United States. They had kind of implicitly assumed that the alliance with the U.S. entailed U.S. support for the military in the event of not only any kind of foreign interference or foreign intervention, but also in case of internal subversion or internal discord. And they were wrong. They kind of learned the hard way that U.S. commitment is predicated more on regional affairs and regional stability and not so much on propping up any one regime. So the Obama administration kind of didn't know who would win out in the Arab Spring, so it hedged its bets. And rather than clearly siding with one or the other player in Egyptian politics post-Arab Spring, they just sort of stood back and waited to see who would kind of come out on top. And maybe if they'd supported the Democrats more in Egypt, things would have been different, but there weren't really any clear-cut Democrats that were anywhere near strong enough to win and or maintain power in Egypt. Your options pretty much were pro-military nationalists versus Islamists, and neither group was particularly palatable to the Obama administration, if not to the U.S. body politic generally. So the result is that the military was able to eventually win that political struggle, destroy, what nascent democratic institutions had been created after the Arab Spring, and basically return Egypt to its previous status quo, which was domination by a de facto pan-Arab nationalist, military-dominated state. But that whole experience with the U.S. hedging its bets, that led to the Egyptian military getting closer with the Saudis because they saw them as a more reliable partner. And the Saudis, for their part, were happy to give them money in order to prop up their influence in the country. So all of that illustrates Saudi influence in Egypt, but also the decline of Egyptian influence in the region, because it's kind of hard to be a regional player when your competitors are kind of floating your budget, bailing you out of debt issues and helping pay for projects and that kind of stuff.
Hi, I wanted
So
to increase my regional influence, but a little bit tight on cash this year. Was wondering if you could
yeah,
fund some adventures. Yeah, I can see how that would take a lot of wind out of their sails.
yeah. So the result is that the only two major local players, as far as regional hegemony, rather, are the Islamist Republic of Iran, which, as the name implies, is mostly Islamist. There's some nationalism in there, but nominally their claim to hegemony is predicated on Islam and Islamism. And then opposing them are the uh, Gulf monarchies, which are kind of Western aligned, but also have historically supported Islamists of one kind or another to try to pacify locals. They've actually been moving away from that model over the past 5 to 10 years. So that's a big change. On the one hand, that's a part of the effort of local Gulf governments to introduce economic development and to try to mitigate the influence of retrograde actors whom are not as interested in making the compromises necessary to move the countries forward and to have economic development and political liberty and sort of things that you would associate with a more modern country. So you could say that's part of a general modernization drive. But the downside is that Islamists in the region are not very happy about it. So that creates a lot of potential for discord if the governments and the monarchies were to slip up somehow and lose what little legitimacy they have left. So monarchies versus Islamists is pretty much what it's down to.
Mm-hmm.
Not great options if you're an outside power trying to maintain your influence in the region, a la the United States.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what we've got.
Well, that makes sense then. The U.S. is trying to play their game of world superpower and world police and stuff, and Iran wants to be the one who's actually the police of the region, making sure people aren't breaking any rules and such. So that would be a
Yeah.
natural, territorial conflict and reason why we might not like each other. Also, having a theocracy is going to be a point of division where they have a fundamentally different method for deciding who's leading and why. So we have just some existential differences in how our cultures work,
Mhm.
which I think makes it a lot harder to find common ground and see each other as allies?
Well, there's not as much difference between the US and Iranian culture as you might think. Sorry, I've got some ice in my mouth. I hope that's not too distracting.
All good.
Um, for a long time, Iran was considered the most westernized and modern country in the Middle East, other than, Israel or Lebanon or kind of one of those Levant territories. So, of the major powers in the region anyway, they were considered the most developed. So there was actually not only good diplomatic relations with Iran, but there was considered relatively more cultural affinity as well. Now, I was actually reading in a sample excerpt of a book I was looking at, I think last year. That affinity actually has relatively deep roots. Like even when, back in the 1700s, when the US was still a colony, there was apparently a lot of sympathetic news reports of the invasion of Iran by Afghan warlords back in the late 1700s. And apparently there was a lot of, for whatever reason, I don't entirely know all the details of this history, but for whatever reason, a lot of people in the colonies in North America at the time thought Iran was sort of the more enlightened of the sultanates in the region. And so they kind of sided with them in their conflicts. It wasn't something they had any direct stake in. I don't think there was like any sort of trade ties or anything. It was just something predicated purely on perceptions of Iran as like a more favorable government, type of government in the region. Or maybe not favorable, but more likable. Let's put it like that. So for a long time, there's kind of been this weird dalliance between Americans and Iran. And in a sense, the past 40 years has been something of a diversion from that. Something of an anomaly, you might say. And there's also the fact that they're both sort of Indo-European cultures and languages. It's Arab is its own separate language. Well, Arabic is its own separate language, and Arab culture has its roots and very separate sort of tree, you might say, different heritage, you might say, than say Europe. Obviously Islam and Arab culture has influenced Iran a lot as well, but historically speaking, Zoroastrianism and whatnot has had, as well as Persian culture, again, generally, has had a lot of influence on the region as a whole, like South Asia and whatnot. And there's some reason to believe that that influence extends back to like the common progenitors of Indo-Europeans generally. So obviously that's not very relevant to like today. But there is like cultural similarities there that create more common ground than is available for, say, the rest of the Middle East and the West.
Mm-hmm.
So there is something there to work with. The theocratic government that was set up after 79 went out of its way to try to mitigate and destroy those ties, specifically because they wanted to avoid what they called West toxification, the toxification of Iranian culture by Western influence of one sort or another. But that influence was never really eradicated. The country had seen too much development beforehand for it to ever really be fully expunged, especially in the larger cities like Tehran, which is why you see periodic protests by people, especially young people who don't like how overbearing the government is.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right in the sense that a theocracy is relatively hard to deal with, diplomatically speaking, from the perspective of a democracy. There certainly are human rights issues there that create friction, mm-hmm. and which in turn inhibit any possibility of progress on this, that, or the other issue between them.
Yeah, we do have our fair share of religious influence in politics as well. It's not like we're completely absent of that.
Unfortunately, that doesn't matter much to the Iranians.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the unwritten rules about international conservatism, such as you can call it, in so much as such a thing can even be said to exist, one of the unwritten rules about conservatives across borders is that they don't get along with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's generally easier for the left wing of international politics to get along because generally they share a common framework, a common, maybe not quite a common ideology. There tends to be a lot of variance there, but it's generally more predicated on cooperation, cosmopolitanism, etc., which inherently lends itself more to deal making and institutionalization of relationships. So it's a little easier for them to get along, whereas reactionaries tend to be more skeptical of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
And that skepticism actually is exacerbated when they run up against the skepticism of other reactionaries. So you tend to get relatively more friction internationally. That's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it can actually lend itself to deal making in so much as there's some raw realpolitik calculations going on, like who's the most powerful, who's the most willing to use force. Once you get into that area, uh, so long as you have two hawks together, kind of like what I was saying before, assuming that they're sufficiently intelligent and not too risk tolerant, they can kind of see who's the more powerful and come to some kind of an agreement predicated on those power calculations.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually can lend itself to a stable international environment, a stable equilibrium in the international ecosystem. But in general, even that outcome doesn't really lend itself to institutionalization, which serves to preserve stability of international systems, whereas international systems, historically speaking, that have had stability predicated purely on raw power, that stability only lasts as long as the power lasts. If whatever turnkey political power, well, I should say, whatever turnkey international power that the international system is dependent on, whatever that is, whenever that declines, that international stability declines with it, and then you return to the state of nature. So institutionalization is not as sexy. It doesn't always work, but it generally lends itself to relatively more stability over the long run, such as my impression. So the result then is that in general, sort of more lefty governments, whatever else can be said about them, I'm not necessarily endorsing here, but in general, they're a little better at that. So no surprise then that the Iranian hawks, being the more sort of reactionary Islamists in the government, they don't really get along with the evangelical Christians in
Yeah.
the United States, even though they kind of share, uh, they don't have a whole lot in common in terms of like respect for human rights, democracy, etc. But there's a range of issues as far as things like ethics, the role of faith in government, and how much their faith influences them in political outlook. There's a lot of shared ground in terms of those areas.
Mm-hmm.
So you might think they would get along better than they do, predicated on that. But like I mentioned, just general skepticism gets in the way of that. And sort of broad disagreements on like details, effectively. You might think, given the common heritage of monotheistic religions, specifically the big three Abrahamic faiths, they would coordinate and get along much better than they do. But in fact, they're pretty deeply skeptical of each other in a lot of cases. You can find some examples of cooperation. I think Jerusalem is probably one of, if not the best example of that, since it's a holy city for everybody and their mother, pretty much. So there's an agreement in which different quarters of the city, or different holy sites in the city anyway, are effectively governed by religious institutions that were set up for the purpose, and which are manned by religious leaders of the local community as representatives of this, that, or the other local faith. So
Mm-hmm.
that has worked for a long time, even going back, I think, to the era in which the city was held and governed by the Turks, even before Israel was even created, or Palestine for that matter. So there can be cooperation, but a lot of the time that cooperation seems to be more imposed from above than
Mm-hmm.
it is something sort of met and agreed to by equals on an even keel. The Ottoman Turks, for example, preferred stable relations between religious minorities and majority religions rather than just having them just beat the shit out of each other and then see who wins, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So they really kind of inculcated that during their time in power there. I feel like I'm just meandering at this point. Was there, were we going somewhere with it?
Well, we just did the check-in with Iran, and then I was trying to get some context for why they're one of those countries that we've sanctioned a whole bunch and we really are not really buddies with.
Yeah.
When a lot of countries were at least neutral. Maybe they dislike us a little bit, but we don't really see them as an enemy. Like, say, for example, France is a country that is a very common critic of the US, but when it comes down to like big issues like the war in Ukraine, they're on the same team. Iran, it seems like they're almost never on the same team with us for issues.
Yeah.
So I was trying to get some context for that, but all that makes sense. There's decades of reasons why we wouldn't get along the best. I did see something in the chat about part of the reason why the operation to rescue the people at the American embassy didn't work out, and it was because the different branches of the military were all trying to partake in this because it was going to be very prestigious if it worked out, so they didn't actually send the best set of people that they could have. It was like they're all wanting to get a piece of the pie.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, might be something to look into.
Well, that makes sense. Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, for sure. And they would want to do it in different ways. We had an idea for something like that for Classic WoW, where it was like a guild leader run, where guild leaders from a whole bunch of other guilds all do a run together, and that didn't happen for probably obvious reasons. But it was a cool idea. What's the other big thing that jumped out at me? Oh, the quote annexation of parts of Ukraine, but then Ukraine is also retaking more territory. Have they made more ground this week from last week? Because last week they got a big deal of ground.
Some incremental gains from what I've read.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Let me check my Ukraine stuff here. Let me get it up to date. I was not expecting the conflict to last this long. My Excel sheet for Ukraine is just growing. It's got so many tabs now. Yeah, there was the Battle of Lyman.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to pronounce it. It's spelled like Lyman, but I'm guessing there's some like native Ukrainian localization that doesn't sound like that. But yeah, there was this town, I guess, called I'm just gonna call it Lyman. You know, somebody in chat can correct me on that. There was a town called Lyman, which was to the southeast of basically the territory that had been taken thus far by the Ukrainian offensive. And the Ukrainians were pushing south to a position east of that town to try to cut off and encircle Russian forces there. And they were making pretty good gains, and eventually the Russians just kind of gave up and evacuated the town. There was some rumors that they may have been encircled, but apparently those were not true. You know, the Russians do seem to have successfully evacuated. But the result is that the Ukrainians were able to liberate a decent-sized town in Donetsk Oblast,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the two Donbass territories that had been nominally bifurcated and separated back in 2014. So they continue to gain some ground. It's not nearly as rapid or expansive as it was earlier, you know, with the initial Kharkiv offensive. Actually, we might have some people who speak Ukrainian listening, so I have a question for them. Is it pronounced Kharkiv or Kharkiv? Because there's not really an H sound in sort of Russian slash Ukrainian, as far as I know. I think it's more supposed to be pronounced something like KH, something like that. So whenever I read Kharkiv, I read it as Kharkiv, but I'm kind of cognizant in the back of my head that it might be something else, more like Kharkiv. But I don't know, I always forget to look it up after the fact. Scatterbrained, moving from one thing to another all the time.
That's okay.
Yeah, actually, that's probably a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I am most definitely not an expert in everything I talk about in here, on here rather. And so if I say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I don't want to make any more of an ass out of myself than I already do on here. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later eventually. To the YouTube commentator from last week, there are rare circumstances in which I will kind of sneak a peek at it. If there's like some particular question that I ask that I'm looking for an answer for, or if I'm just sort of alt tabbing through stuff trying to get to something, I might see chat while it's kind of running, from that. So there are some circumstances where I see it. Just in general, I don't, purposely, methodically read chat while we do the segment.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be clear. But yeah, there was the Battle of Lyman. I think that was the big thing I had. There's been more missile strikes, innocent people being killed in a humanitarian convoy. Just at this point, that's just par for the course. Like I just kind of assume stuff like that happens at this point. It's terrible, and I don't want to say that it's just normal or acceptable, but it just happens with such regularity that it's not necessarily indicative of any major change or trend in the war. That's just on trend at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see it. The only other stuff I had here was the Nord Stream leaks. Had you heard about that?
Yeah, people were asking about that actually.
Yeah, the pipeline sprung a leak mysteriously, and nobody really seems to know why. And there's been a lot of conspiracies about it. The biggest culprit has been the Russians. The Russians are pretty obviously at this point trying to deny natural gas exports to Europe, specifically their own natural gas exports. But that would be weird because they were already doing that. Like they don't need to cause leaks in the pipeline to do that. So I'm not sure what the game plan was there. At the same time, the fact that it doesn't make sense kind of itself makes sense because Russia has done a lot of inexplicable bullshit over the past year or so that just doesn't really make sense. And that would be consistently inconsistent for the Russians to spring a leak in Nord Stream when they don't need to. So it could well have been them, even though it doesn't make sense for them to have done it. The other culprit is the United States. There's actually been some comment on that amongst certain quarters in Germany, apparently, from what I've been reading. There's a sense that the United States has an interest in trying to undermine and destroy any possibility of Europe importing more natural gas from Russia so that Europe can be more dependent on importations of natural gas from the United States. The U.S. being a pretty big exporter of liquid natural gas at this point. But I don't really see that as being that viable either, because Europe is already doing that, right? They're already systematically moving away from Russia to trying to move towards imports of natural gas from anybody and everybody else who can export it. And the Russians, for their part, are helping because they're again going out of their way to try to restrict and pretty much as of now stop exports of natural gas to Europe, which leaves them pretty dependent on what few alternatives there are. And European governments have already made lots of commitments to cut out future imports of Russian natural gas and to make every effort as best they can to make that transition happen as quickly and efficiently as possible. So, if you're the United States, like, why do you need to sabotage Nord Stream then? Like, there's no point to it. It wasn't being used already. Nord Stream 2 had been scrapped. The Germans refused to certify its usage after the war started. And Nord Stream 1 was had already ceased export of natural gas as a result of, Russian bullshitting, basically. They had this, that, or the other excuse over the past couple months to basically curtail or shut off export of natural gas. So, in the short term anyway, there's no real benefit given that the pipelines were already not being used. In the medium term, I would imagine they could be fixed pretty easily. And in the long term, they're not going to be used anyway, since I would expect at this point anyway, given the strength of the signals that have come out of Europe, that Europe really will follow through and just move away from Russian natural gas, either permanently or semi-permanently. So there's no real advantage then to just sabotaging the pipeline from the perspective of the United States. I don't really see what we get out of that. It just seems like needless risk taking. You get everything you want by doing nothing and incurring no cost. So why incur the cost of doing something? It just seems like a weird move in that sense.
Wasted APM, we would say in StarCraft.
There you go.
So we don't think that it's the US because they don't really gain too much from it, and we don't think that it's Russia because they also don't gain too much from it. It could have been a kind of random accident, but it also could have been sea creatures getting revenge for the oil spills in the water.
Well, I mean, if you're a sea creature and you don't want stuff in your water, busting a pipeline and leaking out, shit tons of natural gas seems like a weird move. But yeah, I guess that's kind of on par for regional politics at this point.
All right, Agent Smith has exonerated the sea creatures. He doesn't think they did it either.
Yeah, there's no gas being pumped through the pipeline, but there was still gas in the pipeline when the leak happened. So there was a pretty decent amount that was leaked, which is where the pictures on, Reddit and the news came from. So that's a mystery. We'll see what comes of that. My guess is that whatever the answer is going to be stupid. So there will be some entertainment value at least. What else did I have here? Oh yeah, the Russians set up a enlistment center on the border with Georgia. So I told you last week that there was a lot of people in Russia who, after the mobilization order was distributed, immediately decided to just get the hell out as fast as they could. And so there was a big long line at the main border crossing with Georgia, because that was one of the main countries that Russians have been going to. I think they have like visa-free. I think Russia has a visa-free travel agreement with Georgia or something like that. So it's a particularly attractive locale for emigres coming from Russia. So the Russian government, for its part, kind of knows that a lot of people that it's trying to draft are trying to flee the country to avoid having to be deployed, and well, to avoid deployment rather. So they set up an enlistment center to try to catch people basically as they're moving through that border crossing. So I thought that was an interesting move, and it kind of shows, for one, how desperate the government is, and also how big the exodus is out of Russia. There's so many people trying to get out and evade mobilization that the government is having to, pull these hokey little tricks to try to mitigate the impact. Let's see, I also had a note from our article in the Moscow Times about how, I don't know if scared is the right word, but how unsettled people are in the Russian elite. Maybe not the Russian elite per se, but sort of the upper echelon of Russian society. The upper middle class, the management class. These kinds of people have kind of been, who are pretty good about protecting themselves within the context of the Russian political system. They know how to maneuver within it and sort of defend themselves in it and protect their interests. But a lot of those people are getting increasingly anxious, especially after the mobilization order, because they don't really know what's going to happen at this point. What they see is a government that is increasingly eroding not only the rights of regular people, but is also increasingly infringing on the privileges of some of the people who had thought of themselves as borderline immune to the government's bullshit. So that's resulted in increasing anxiety, and it's not entirely clear what kind of impact that's going to have. It's upper middle classes frequently have a lot of vested interests in the status quo, but they're also uniquely positioned to change that status quo because, while they're not the most powerful, they are disproportionately powerful relative to the working class. And at the same time, they generally have positions in power that allow them to really kind of screw things up if they really want to. Being managers, they can organize stuff. And ideally, they're organizing things and institutions and parties that protect the status quo and kind of keep things quiet. But if they get pissed off, they can organize a revolution, or at least institutions that undermine the status quo in a way that you as an elite are not going to like. So whereas before, most of the cost of the war was kind of on the lower class or the working class or ethnic minorities or what have you, increasingly it's starting to impact the day-to-day lives of people who are much more influential within Russian politics. So I would not go so far as to say this is going to inevitably lead to revolution or even necessarily to further protests or unrest from quarters of the population that have historically been more passive or even pro-government, but it is going to undermine some support for the government, and it is going to lead to some consternation rather amongst some of those traditionally supportive classes, and in turn to hedging behavior, which could come at a cost to the government's ability to mobilize and administer Russia. Well, we'll see what comes of that. I thought it was a pretty interesting article. Actually, I'll send that to you because you might find it an interesting read as well. Let's see, where are you? Neuro. Oh yeah, I forgot to give you the book title. You were asking about that. Somebody was asking about that David Hackworth book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the title was About Face, The Odyssey of an American Warrior. Yeah, I've actually got that still. It's a fun read. Yeah, I was a little bit wrong about some of the details. Actually, a lot of the details that I mentioned when I was referencing the book last week, because I was talking about how there was a second crisis, basically, over Berlin and access therein around 1960. That was not correct. The Soviets never cut off access like that. There was not a second Berlin crisis. Rather, it was the construction of the Berlin Wall that instigated a minor crisis. It was more of a confrontation than a crisis. Basically, the Soviets started building the wall, and so then the West felt obligated to respond, and so they responded with a show of force, where there was large convoys of military units that were run from West Germany to West Berlin along the highway that ran through East Germany. So not quite right there. Also, the Soviet officer that I said was kicked in the face was not kicked in the face. Rather, he was hit in the face with the butt of a rifle. You know, he was still struck either way, but the infantryman in the truck actually hit him with his gun, not with his boot. Yeah, I went back and read the chapter in the book. It's actually really fun to read. You know, some books are a chore to read. You just try to get through them and it's kind of a grind. But then some books are just a breeze to read and you don't ever want to put it down. And, you know, for me, this is one of those. It's a very long book, actually. I think Amazon was saying it was like 800 pages, but it really didn't feel like it after I was done. You just read through that like a hot knife through butter. It's a very accessible writing style.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm almost tempted to read from it.
If you want to
one excerpt.
If you want to read an excerpt, you can.
I'm not very good at reading, though. Not out loud, that is to say. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, 800 pages. It's a big read, but it flies by. I actually read excerpts of this to Michael back in the day. Do you remember that?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, I went through and had some selected passages, and I kind of wanted to go over them and just have a conversation with him about war, military history, the U.S. Army, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Just lots of cool stories. It's more of a memoir than anything.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of personal impressions and personal experiences. You know, if you have a, I don't know how many people are listening who are veterans, you know, people with actual experience in the military. But you in particular may like this book because it's very much written by, you know, a career Army guy. So you may find at least the stories relatable to your own experiences. Oh, where the hell was it? Oh, there we go. Yeah, it's just like a paragraph. You know, are you up for it?
Hell yeah. Fire away, Captain.
Now, I can't speak like Hackworth, like a soldier or whatever. So this is just going to be me reading verbatim. So it's going to be a little boring in that sense, but hopefully I can kind of convey this in order to make up for the fact that I just kind of screwed it up last week when I was trying to relay the story. And let's see. Yeah, I guess I'll start here. The thing about the wall was that despite Khrushchev's big offensive threats in the years preceding his decisive act in Berlin, the wall itself, as any soldier should know, was a defensive concern. It wasn't defensive in a strategic war-making sense. It had not been built to prevent the West invading Soviet-controlled soil. Berlin had been like an hourglass, the people of East Germany flowing to the western sector relentlessly, like grains of sand. And no matter how much the Soviets narrowed the aperture, the people kept on coming. Every day we were there, East Germans tried to escape. And the Vopos, that's slang for East German soldiers. And the Vopos, besides the scores who made the break themselves, tried to stop them. At least two were brutally slain swimming the 50 yards between east and west across the Teltow Canal, shot in the back by East German soldiers. Double strands of barbed wire along the canal bank had closed that escape route, but it didn't matter. The determined still found a way and always would. The Berlin Wall was simply an exceptionally effective monument to the failure of the communist people system. Khrushchev had solved his problem, but at a very high price. At the checkpoint coming out of Berlin, my unit was inspected by a Soviet captain. The Russians were mad people and truck counters. We'd gone through the same drill, governed by provisions in the Potsdam Agreement, on the way in, detrucking, lining up in files, and waiting for an okay to keep moving. Though I'd thought these inbound checks had been without incident, when we reached Berlin, I'd heard one quite amazing story involving a member of one of my squads. The rule was that though the Reds could make us unload and reload at any time they wanted, and though they could inspect the contents of our vehicles at will, they were not allowed to touch the vehicles themselves in any way. Apparently, a Russian third lieutenant, too short to adequately inspect one of the trucks, had stood up on the tongue of the attached trailer to get a better view. One of our Spec 4s, an old World War II guy who'd been a master sergeant, but never seemed to be able to hold his rank thanks to the 3-day binges he went on every time the Eagle shit, and who was sitting in the truck by the tailgate, had hauled off and butt-stroked the Soviet in the face with his M1. The third lieutenant landed, bloody and dazed, at the feet of his boss, a colonel. Everyone in the truck had figured that this was it. Hello, World War III. Instead, the Russian colonel had jerked the boy to his feet and dragged him away behind a building where he chewed the lieutenant's ass to borscht at the top of his voice. What had interested me more about this episode was that despite the overall tension, despite the Soviet bombers too close for comfort provocative overflight, and the Vopo and Soviet guns tracking us the whole way up the East German corridor, that Russian colonel, the guy on the ground, had been in no hurry to start a big confrontation. Still, as I saluted the Red Officer now on our way out, I just hoped our Spec 4 would not give an encore performance. Sir, I said, my unit is ready for inspection. Kind of goes on from there, but that's the gist of it. So I wasn't too far off the mark.
Nice. What did you say the name of the book was again?
That's About Face, The Odyssey of an American Warrior, Colonel David Hackworth.
Nice.
Yeah, I just kind of, I went back and found that specific section because I wanted to check my work from last week, which obviously needed to be checked. But then I also just kind of remembered that I could pretty much open the book to anywhere, just a random page, and read and enjoy it. And I did, and ended up reading for like an hour and a half. So I definitely give it high marks. It's maybe not for everybody, but I found it very enjoyable.
Nice.
Let's see. I think that was all I had for Ukraine. Yeah. So what else did we have? Was there something else that you wanted to kind of get into?
Well, those were the two big ones that jumped out at me this week. I didn't really see anything else that was that substantive. There was someone in chat who was asking what your opinion was on Mohammed bin Salman, the crown sultan of Saudi Arabia. They didn't really specify what about him.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. So the impression of him in the West is very, very negative because of, the murder and dismemberment of the journalist. probably a fair assessment. I can't begrudge that. But what I think a lot of casual observers in the West maybe don't know about Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is that he's actually seen as a progressive. He's seen as a reformer who is challenging the status quo, who is mitigating the influence and power of the clerisy in Saudi governance and in society. He's loosened up a lot of rules that have restricted access to women to public spaces, and he's reduced repression to a degree. Not obviously not all of it, but Saudi Arabia is a relatively less repressive place than it used to be. And a lot of young people in particular in Saudi Arabia actually like him because of that. That's not to say he doesn't have his critics, and that's not to say there's a lot of things that the Saudi government does that are unpalatable, even to people who live there. But in general, the mood that I've read in Saudi Arabia amongst Saudis, and again, particularly among young people in Saudi Arabia, is that they're pretty positive on Mohammed bin Salman and that they're optimistic about Saudi Arabia's future. So that's a very different image of Mohammed bin Salman than exists in the West, where he's seen more as a butcher, a murderer, an autocrat, an authoritarian, etc., and all of the things that are associated with those elements. So, my perspective is that maybe he's not an enlightened despot. I think he would need to do more to kind of earn that moniker, but I think he's kind of in that vein. For Saudi leadership, he's pretty progressive. I would give him credit for taking Saudi Arabia in a different direction and doing more to kind of plan for a post-oil Saudi economy, which previous governments had done relatively little to actually do in practice. I don't know how much of what they're doing in that vein is going to end up paying off. There seems to be a high tolerance of risk, you might say, in some of the projects. I think Neom in particular is kind of the case in point. Have you heard of Neom, Neuro?
No, what's that?
It's a major project in the northwest of Saudi Arabia to try to build a whole new city, basically out of whole cloth, out of nothing, in the middle of the desert, and have it be a model, basically a cutting edge technologically architectural marvel that is going to kind of incorporate everything that is new in terms of sustainability, in terms of energy, in terms of public transportation, to try to create an optimally efficient city. And it looks super weird. It's like the architectural equivalent of postmodern art. It's very deeply weird. It's literally just a line. Like when you think of a city, you kind of think of a circle, right? So you've got like downtown in the middle, and then you've got sort of residential areas around that, and then maybe suburbs around that and the outer ring, and then maybe exurbs beyond that. So it kind of has more of a circular shape. But this city is going to be just a line, literally a line. It's maybe like, what is it, like a couple hundred yards like wide at any given point, but then it's several miles long. So it's a very long city, but very thin. It's a very strange layout. But the way that they're going to try to make that work is by having layers. So at the bottom layer, they're actually going to have public transportation, right? So that's where like the metro is going to be. And it's going to be a very high-speed metro that will allow you to arrive at any point in the city, even the points that are the furthest away from you, in at least something like 10 to 20 minutes, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you just want to go from one end of the city to the other, and actually it's more than a couple miles long, I think it's even much longer than that. But the point is that you'll be able to go a very long distance from one end of the city to the other in a very short amount of time. And they want to set it up like that so that it's feasible for people to work in one part of the city but live in a part of the city that's much further away. Mm-hmm. So the idea is to have all transportation be predicated on that metro system there underground. And then the second tier, which is also going to be underground, is going to be sort of for trucks. They will have some roads, but those are going to be for commercial use. The actual residents and workers, they're going to be maybe not obligated per se, but there's going to be a lot of pressure, just in terms of the way the design and layout is for them to use the metro to get wherever it is they need to go instead of driving. And basically, they'll have no choice, because of the first layer. The top layer, which will be actually above ground, will have basically no roads. It's basically just going to be residential buildings and parks and that's about it. Maybe some commercial areas as well. But effectively, you're not going to have much choice but to use that third layer metro system because your options as far as driving are going to be pretty limited. I imagine maybe some people will be able to drive on the roads in the second layer, but the way I was reading it, it seemed like options would be fairly limited there, or at least access would be relatively limited there. Also, it's going to have big giant mirror walls for some reason. I'm not sure what that's about.
Mirror walls?
Well, yeah, because it's a big line.
Uh-huh.
But the city is also going to be de facto enclosed. So, like, the sides of the line along the city are going to be like several stories tall, and they're going to be plated, I guess, with mirrors, or maybe some kind of highly reflective glass. And so the interior then between those large walls is where the actual city will be. So that it'll be somewhat open air. There'll be space between the walls where sunlight and air and stuff can get in, but otherwise it's going to be more like a canyon almost, at least how it was described anyway. Very strange stuff. It's a very weird project. But because it's so experimental and because it uses so much new technology and because there's almost literally nothing there right now, there's almost literally, well, I mean, I guess there's been some construction as of now, but before the project started, it was just desert. Like there was no substantive infrastructure, urban development. Like they're really having to start from scratch. And so because of all those factors, it's enormously expensive. It's going to be something like over $1 trillion when all is said and done. So, even for an oil wealthy country like Saudi Arabia, that's going to be a heavy lift. And it's all the more so given that they don't know how the project is going to turn out. Like the amount of time that it's going to take to finish the project is something on the order of 20, 30 years. So this is not like a short-term thing they're doing. So on the one hand, if it works out, then I don't know, maybe it turns into a big money generator somehow. They also want to have that area where they're building the city be like a free trade zone, effectively, so that they attract investment and have actual economic activity happening there rather than just money transfers from the government predicated on royalties from oil revenue. So hypothetically, if that works out, there will be manufacturing and services industries there driving the economy such that people will actually want to live there, and activity that can then also be taxed by the government to try to replace revenue from what will presumably be declining revenue from oil over the next couple of decades. So hypothetically, that could work, but it's a big gamble given how much they're spending and given how long it's going to take for the project to actually finish and turn around. So we'll see. We'll see. But that's an example of the kind of high risk, high reward type of project that the Saudi government seems to be interested in under Mohammed bin Salman's leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a little more risky than they should be. Well, maybe that's a little more risky in terms of a more risky a project than they should be doing, basically. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? If you play it safe, then maybe you don't end up with enough benefit to really replace all that lost oil revenue in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not going to nitpick. I'm not in a position to judge. It's their country. Well, Mohammed bin Salman's country, effectively, at this point. But yeah, overall, the original question was, what do I think of him? I think he's a reformer, but he's not a big reformer. He's not like a liberalizer per se. I don't think his end objective is a Saudi Arabia that is liberal in its economic management, its politics, or its society. I think bin Salman is easing up the pressure on Saudi Arabia as a practical measure, given the structural changes in the economy, again, vis-a-vis oil revenue that are coming, that are predicted to play out over the next couple decades. And I think he wants to make his mark by trying to prepare Saudi Arabia as best he can for that transition. I think the biggest negative for Mohammed bin Salman at this point is his foreign policy. I think early on in his tenure, early on in his tenure as leader, he was more adventurous in his foreign policy than he needed to be. I think other than economic issues, which he's done better on, he also wanted to try to project more force in the Middle East. He wanted Saudi Arabia to step up and be more of a leader in the region in order to replace what was perceived by the Saudi establishment as a United States foreign policy that involved the United States increasingly withdrawing from the region. Not completely withdrawing, but less and less involved to the point where the Saudis did not feel that the U.S. security umbrella was sufficiently strong for the Saudis to sit back and just outsource all of the region's security issues exclusively to the United States. So the Saudis then wanted to step up. They wanted to project more force, have more influence, and take more of a leading role. But the way that manifested was in terms of interfering in the Yemeni civil war, with the result that the Saudi military ended up sort of embroiled in a, what would you call it? Quagmire. There we go. The Saudi military ended up getting embroiled in a long-term quagmire for which they had no clear-cut exit strategy or win conditions. And that was only to the detriment of regional security as well as to the Saudis, since they were already kind of trying to save money. Again, they want to put more money into the future and into economic development, but the whole Yemeni conflict has just turned into a big money sink. And again, because there's no clear-cut way out that would not be either, embarrassing or would preserve Saudi interests in Yemen, they're kind of stuck with it. So that's, I would say, the downside there. The foreign policy has not really landed as well.
And they're a country that is, compared to Iran, a lot more integrated with the U.S. in terms of like buying our military goods and stuff. That's been one of
the... Well, that's kind of part of the quid pro quo, because we do not have a treaty alliance with Saudi Arabia, or really any other Gulf nation for that matter. I think we might have some kind of nominal bilateral agreement with Kuwait. But other than Kuwait, no. There's no real obligation to defend them per se. Kuwait would be the one we had the most obligation to defend, and then we kind of have an implicit obligation to defend Qatar. But that's just because we have a huge naval base in Qatar. One of the Navy's fleets is actually headquartered there. So even if we're not necessarily obligated by treaty to defend Qatar in the event of some kind of invasion, we would want to defend the naval base. So effectively, we're going to defend Qatar. But with the Saudis, we don't have the same relationship. The relationship with the Saudis is much more based on national security concerns. The Saudis want protection. We want to ensure that the oil money, as represented by Saudi oil exports, is not used for anything that might run counter to U.S. interests in the region. And so we offer security in exchange for nominal compliance as far as the Saudi government with U.S. foreign policy objectives in the Middle East. And part of that quid pro quo is that the Saudis will use some of their oil money revenue to buy military equipment from the United States. They don't even really use it, or at least I should refrain and I should say that the Saudis have not historically used the military equipment that they bought from the United States, or at least not very much. Under Mohammed bin Salman, they've actually been using it more because of the Saudi involvement in Yemen. But historically, and to a degree now, most of that military equipment they were buying was just for show. Mostly it was just kind of a thank you note from the Saudis to the U.S., for the security umbrella, and also to give them some influence within U.S. politics, for which the military-industrial complex, as it's commonly known, does carry some weight. Yeah, it's a relationship that we also have with other countries that we're allied with. In some cases, though, actually in a lot of cases, we'll actually give them money to buy stuff from us in that regard. So like Egypt, for example, and it used to be Pakistan as well, although I don't think we do it anymore. We would give them military aid in the form of money, or at least some kind of vouchers. I don't remember the exact details, but basically they were given the money so that their militaries could buy some of the best tech that the United States had on offer, at least that was legal to export anyway. We actually reserve the best tech for ourselves. But of the stuff that was available for export, we actually gave that to them effectively for free. We gave them the money to buy it, and then they bought it from U.S. producers. And so effectively, it was a way of the U.S. government spending more money on the military without actually spending money on the military in a normal way. So that works out for everybody. The U.S. government gets to reshore a relationship with another country. The other country gets modern military equipment, and military producers get to maintain production lines, which more or less is an important objective since you don't want to lose those skill sets. So you're kind of ticking a lot of boxes and squaring a lot of circles by managing relations in this way. With the Saudis, we do some of that. We do give them military aid, but a lot of the money they spend on the military, I believe, is their own. Now, back in the 70s, to go on a little tangent, there was also an implicit agreement made by which the Saudis would use some of their oil money to buy US treasuries. And they'd kind of already been doing that, but it was really the most important during the big crises in the 70s, specifically with the oil embargoes by the Saudis and the Iranians, and then also with stagflation that corresponded with it in the United States. And also the whole euro dollar thing and the, Europeans being reluctant to kind of change their monetary policies to help maintain the Bretton Woods system. They had some good reasons for that, but there was a lot of stuff going on in terms of the global economy at the time that resulted in a lot of churn and instability, economically speaking. So the result of that was a minor fiscal crisis in the United States, by which the United States was finding it increasingly difficult to find buyers for US debt. And so that meant it was basically becoming almost impossible for the United States government to continue to fund its debt. In other words, to continue to fund fiscal deficits. And that was a big problem because they needed to do that to pay for Great Society programs, that is to say, welfare programs, as well as to continue to prosecute the war in Vietnam, which was, a huge money sink for the United States at the time, as well as to deal with various other crises. We were having to fund gasoline producers, for example, to try to deal with the high price of gas and various other interventions. The 70s was a mess in a lot of ways, so this was just one of them. So the US government tried to deal with that in different ways, but finally they just resorted to implicitly, not directly, but implicitly threatening the Saudis that the US would invade Saudi Arabia if they did not resume buying US treasuries with petrodollars, which they did, and that resolved the crisis. The US dollar increased in value and stopped its slide. US debt was able to find buyers, so the US was able to continue funding the deficit, and the crisis was resolved in that manner. And petrodollars continued to be used to prop up the US dollar and US treasuries for a long time after that. But contrary to what some people would have you believe, it's not nearly as important now. And I would go even further and say it's not really that major a factor in terms of the value of the US dollar or US treasuries anymore. It's a factor, but there are lots of other buyers at this point. Capital markets globally are so liquid and large now that petrodollars are not nearly as important as they were back in the 70s, when global capital markets were still heavily regulated, we're still recovering from all the world wars, and we're still much smaller in scale. So having a major buyer like the Saudis with their petrodollars, as well as other Gulf producers, that was a big deal. They were probably one of the largest, if not the largest buyers on global capital markets at that time. The same is not really true now. Certainly not as true. But regardless, the point is, at that time, petrodollars basically saved US treasuries. And since then, treasuries have rebounded significantly. Where was I going with that? Lost my train of thought. Something Saudis.
Mohammed bin Salman, what are your opinions on him? He's building a really weird city. He's more of a progressive as far as monarchs go in doing ambitious projects. I want to see some pictures of this city. It seems interesting. I have watched a few different documentaries on city planning and just the efficiency of transport and stuff. And in the US in particular, we do waste a lot of money just with how we do zoning laws and things like that. So seeing how a city can be constructed in a more elegant and efficient way so that people can move from place to place with less energy consumption necessary to do what they need to do.
Let me see. I'm going to try to find you one of the videos I watched. And I can't find it, so I'll try to send that to you later.
Okay.
Yeah, it is very funky looking now. Actually, maybe I could just send a picture. I'll kind of get the idea across. I think that's pretty representative. I'll send that. That's a good one. Copy image. Neuro. Now there's another one. And then I'll send it diagonally out. I think this is it. So this diagram I'm sending you is like a rough breakdown of the different layers that I was talking about. So you can see the metro tubes on the bottom, and then the weird looking, what I guess are electric trucks in the second layer on the roads. And then the top layer is greenery and people and whatnot.
Cool. I'll show these pictures to stream after I'm out of this game. The weird line city design. I wonder why that is what they're going for in terms of shape.
I think they want to do it to try to basically force people to rely disproportionately on the mass transportation. Well, yeah, it sounds goofy, but like if you just do a normal layout, it would not necessarily be easy, but people would be tempted just to use the roads, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you manipulate the layout of the city such that roads are just impractical, then it's much easier to incentivize use of mass transportation. But that's entirely dependent on the mass transportation being sufficiently fast and efficient that, it actually works, as far as getting people to where they need to go quickly. So I think that's why they were investing so much in not just a metro, but a high-speed metro. They made a big deal about that. Yeah, city planners really like mass transportation. It's very efficient in a lot of ways, but some people don't like it. And the result is that in societies where consumers have relatively more discretion, shall we say, a lot of cities end up having pretty large road networks in order to cater to people who prefer automotive transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, automotive gives you more privacy and freedom of motion than if you're bound to some set tracks, but the tracks overall are going to be less energy consumption per person.
Exactly.
And less traffic as well. Yeah, for the US, owning a car is one of the things that's like partly a status symbol, but also kind of part of just cultural identity for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, people really like that here, just being able to go wherever you want, whenever you want, at your own discretion. That's pretty important.
Oh, kind of tying the two things together. I had heard a while back that women weren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. Was that something that changed at any point, or is that still the case?
I think they relaxed the rules on that. I honestly don't remember. Some of the stuff regarded clothing and letting women go to places like concerts and other public venues, and being outside without a male chaperone. I think that's more what they were focusing on. As far as drivers, let me see.
Became legal in 2018 is what chat is saying.
Okay, I would defer to Chad on that then.
It's pretty recent though.
Yeah, but that was pretty early on in his reign, so it was kind of one of the early things that he did.
And is he ruling after he had a parent rule? Like his father was in power and then he took it when his father passed away?
That's a little complicated. But there's been some melodrama within the Saudi royal family over the past five some years. They've had a succession of very elderly kings in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of them didn't really have the motivation or maybe even just the energy to really do big, ambitious stuff while they were in power. And a lot of them started delegating more authority to, you know, basically what were viziers, the sort of administrative leaders. And it was expected for a while that the guy that would be put in charge uh, in 2016, 15, whenever it was going to be this dude who had been a national security advisor and who had been in charge of a lot of the counterterrorism operations within Saudi Arabia. And I don't remember his name, but he was supposed to be the lead guy. But what happened is that this other guy, who was in the Saudi royal family, he was like a prince, basically. He outmaneuvered him and was able to appoint his son in that position. And that son was Muhammad bin Salman. And I feel like I'm forgetting a lot of the details here, but basically, Muhammad bin Salman is not actually in charge of Saudi Arabia. He's not the king per se. But the king, such as he is, has granted him basically all of the power. He's given him the ability to run the state as he sees fit. And that's why he's considered the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia.
Why did the king do that? And what does the king do then?
I mean, historically, he's an absolute monarch, but, again, because the kings of Saudi Arabia over the past couple generations have kind of been not very active, they're too risk averse to do big reforms, but they also know that something needs to be done. And so I think they've become more receptive over time to the idea that a more ambitious reformer and a younger man should be given more discretion in terms of how the kingdom is run, so that some of these efforts can be made and some of the necessary changes be made. They didn't want to be the ones to do it, but they knew somebody needed to try. So they kind of made Mohammed bin Salman that guy. But it didn't have to be him. There was, the important thing here wasn't just that they wanted somebody to do that. They also, his appointment was also the result of no small amount of political maneuvering on the part of his father. Is his father the king? Maybe I'm mixing people up. Yes, father. It is his father. I knew I was screwing something up. He's crown prince and prime minister. Okay, yeah. So his father succeeded the previous king, and then there was some question about who would fill the leading positions in the government, in the king's cabinet, and MBS was granted that role, whereas before it was presumed that role would be given to the national security advisor guy, who, by the way, was on very good terms with the United States. The U.S. was actually looking forward to that appointment, because the U.S. obviously has historically worked with the Saudis quite a bit on counterterrorism. And so because we had such a positive working relationship with this guy, we were really hoping, that is to say, the U.S. government was hoping that he would kind of get the appointment. But MBS outmaneuvered him with the cooperation of his father, the king. And so the result is that we ended up with something of an unknown quantity. Yeah, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, definitely brought a lot of energy to the role, but he's also very clearly moving up the learning curve, making some mistakes and learning the hard way in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as far as to his accession to power, it was his father who put him there.
Mm-hmm.
And he was put there specifically, one, to reform Saudi Arabia, and also because his father wanted to kind of secure his branch's hold on the throne. Because one of the things that happens in Saudi politics that you don't really see explicitly too much is the political maneuvering within the royal family. There's tons and tons of people in it. It's like 10,000 people within the Saudi royal family. So it's not like a small family. And all of them technically have some claim on the throne.
Mm-hmm.
So, who succeeds the last king is always like a big question. Generally, they try to work that out beforehand. But even afterwards, there's generally people who are unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
So MBS's father very much won that last competition, basically, to see who would succeed his predecessor. But by appointing his son in this leading role, he's making it more likely that his son will succeed him
Mm.
and will be able to maintain control within his segment of the family over Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the internal politics of the Saudi royal family. I'm more familiar with like Saudi economic management and foreign policy.
Mm.
But that's my understanding of it from what I've read.
Do they have any other branches of government? Like, is the royal family the de facto executive branch, and then they have other representatives? Maybe a judiciary of some kind?
No, they do have separate government institutions. Like the king is just the head of government, but they do have a separate executive branch
Mm.
that the king heads, which is filled out by nominally professionals, like people within the royal family generally get the most important positions, but they try to give them, I think, to people who have some background with the position in question.
Mm.
But beyond the royal family and the appointments thereof within the executive branch, there is like a professional civil service there
Mm.
that provides services. Some of those people are professionals who actually genuinely do their job, but some of them are just basically there so that the government can have rewards to give in the form of patronage. They want to have jobs to give to people to keep them from protesting and to pacify them. So jobs for the sake of jobs within the government, basically.
Mm.
So there's some of that as well. I don't think there's any legislature. There might be like some local stuff, like local city councils or something, or maybe some traditional forms of councils, in the rural areas, but I'm not aware of them. I haven't read enough about political institutions in Saudi Arabia to know the answer to that. And I think there is a judicial system, but I think it's disproportionately dominated by like religious actors. I remember there was a big outcry a couple of years ago amongst the clerisy because the government under MBS said that they wanted to move away from a legal system predicated on Islamist law, Sharia law. They didn't want to get rid of Sharia law entirely, but they wanted to create more secular institutions, more secular judicial institutions that could fill out a role in certain segments of society. I think commercial is the one they were mostly thinking of, but probably also others as well. So yeah, they do have other institutions, but all of them are well under the thumb of the royal family.
Mm-hmm.
There's no room to maneuver as far as like representative governance or anything.
Mm-hmm. And they've ruled in this way for quite some time.
1920s.
1920s.
Yeah, that was when the Saudis were able to basically unify the territories that now comprise Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
They'd been around before that, but I think Saudi Arabia kind of achieved its final borders in the 1920s, as I understand it. Yeah, that was sort of when the Saudis were originally like a tribe, I think, from the interior of Saudi Arabia. And they were basically sort of tribal nomadic warriors.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were the ones that kind of launched the wars by which they unified what is now Saudi Arabia. It was very different then.
Mm-hmm.
Oil money very much transformed the country. But yeah, it's not that old in the grand scheme of things. I guess only about 100 years old at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the region isn't particularly hospitable for farming or just living, so
Yeah.
their status as like a very wealthy country is more related to that natural resource.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much the dominant aspect of their political economy. You can understand a lot of Saudi politics and foreign policy and whatnot just by way of oil.
Mm-hmm.
just on account of how important it is. Huh. How are we doing? We started at 8.
Yep. Got another
So,
40 minutes or so.
gotcha. Yeah, I'd forgotten. Was it? I had thought it was this weekend, but I guess it's next weekend we have to skip. Is that what it was?
Yep. TwitchCon.
Got it. I got a little confused today. I was having trouble remembering.
Do we have a world discussion today or not? Don't know. Yes, my lord, we will have a show.
What else is going on? Brazil is having its presidential election. Did you see that?
Yeah, chat mentioned that earlier. Bolsonaro 44%. The other person was like 47, so pretty close.
Yeah, that's what the BBC was saying. Some of these elections happen on Sundays. They kind of catch me off guard sometimes. I'll kind of mention that I don't know when the election is or what the outcome will be, but then unknowingly, the election is happening at the exact same time I'm talking about it. So yeah, Brazil is having its election. The BBC is reporting that there's going to be a runoff because nobody got over, what was it, 50%? Something like that. So let's see. Oh yeah, here it is. With almost all of the votes counted, Lula had won 48% and Bolsonaro 43%. So Lula was actually ahead. It surprised me. Bolsonaro was pretty far ahead in some of the early exit polling. It's a pretty big gap to come to make up, but I guess Lula was able to do it. Let's see. So what is it? 4 weeks. So the runoff vote will be 4 weeks from now, 1 month. Well, that'll be exciting. You know, I don't know enough about like the composition of political parties in Brazil to know who among the people who did not vote for either Lula or Bolsonaro will vote in the upcoming runoff. I would have to kind of dig into their preferences and kind of see how things shake out. I tried to do that with Peru's runoff like a year or two ago, and I failed miserably. So I'm a little wary about doing it again. I'll probably just wait and see like everybody else. Brazil has quite a few political parties, so you're not lacking for options there in politics.
The Brazilians in the chat perking up. Funny to tune in and hear you guys talk about my country. Brazilian here, and we're on topic today. Cool. Nice.
Yeah, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but it's like a kind of a foreign policy issue for the United States because the Biden administration does not have the best relations with Bolsonaro. So they're kind of hoping that he doesn't win so that it's not something they have to really think about. It's not something they pay too much attention to anyway. I don't think Brazil is like a major foreign policy objective for the United States. But there are some issues for which there is some concern. Bolsonaro just kind of being of the populist right wing of the sort of Western political spectrum, that kind of makes him a little suspect in terms of his stance on issues like Russia, Iran, whatnot. And there's also the whole environmental issue of the Amazon and a lot of the deforestation that's been happening there under his government. So there's some pressure on Western governments, including the US government, to be more proactive on stuff like that. And I don't think the US government really cares that much. I don't think they're gonna really do that much about it, but they would rather not have that pressure than have it. And if there's a Lula government, I would imagine that a prospective Lula government will be relatively more likely to work with the United States on issues like deforestation in the Amazon and Russia and other kinds of things like that than a second-term Bolsonaro administration would be. So there is some attention being paid for once to Brazil within Washington as a result.
Yeah, Bolsonaro would have more of the like tough on the U.S. stance.
Relatively speaking.
Yeah.
He had pretty good relations with Trump while he was in office, and so Bolsonaro was kind of caught off balance when Biden won. Because obviously Biden is basically the anti-Trump, in so many ways. So Bolsonaro really kind of had to make some big adjustments if he wanted to be on good terms with Biden, and it doesn't seem like he really wanted to do that, or at least not as much as he would have needed to.
Hmm.
So relations have been a little bit weird since 2020 on account of that. U.S. relations with South America are weird in the best of circumstances. It's always been awkward relationships predicated on sort of shaky common ground,
Hmm.
what little there is. Communism was convenient. Lots of people in South America really hate communism, so we were able to cooperate on that.
Hmm.
But then after the Soviet Union collapsed, relationships had to be predicated on something else, and we never really found that something else. At this point, relations are kind of running on inertia or maybe momentum, depending on how you want to frame it. Argentina is on the US list of major non-NATO allies, and I really can't tell you why. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, I mean, we've been relatively close before, especially in the 70s when we were, murdering communists and stuff during that whole Kissinger era of history, which is very controversial. So ties were pretty close then. But before that, they'd been pretty rocky, especially in World War II. And they were pretty rocky afterwards, especially like the Falklands War and whatnot. And then
Hmm.
after that, after the Cold War ended, there was never any reason not to be friendly, but I was never quite sure why non-NATO ally status was extended. I think that was extended by the Clinton administration. So, if I had to guess, and I kind of do, I think it was done more for diplomatic reasons. There was not much reason not to. It created a new source of consumption for the defense industry, and it kind of solidified what was already a relatively decent relationship. But beyond that, there was just no history there, like as far as real substantive defense cooperation.
And then I think last week we mentioned that Brazil is like wanting to be a major player in the region, but one of the things that makes it a little bit weird for that is that they're basically surrounded by Spanish speaking countries and they speak
Yeah,
Portuguese.
yeah. Brazil has always had a weird relationship with its neighbors on account of that. Like they used to be rivals, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire for a long time were rivals. It kind of got, even that was weird because for a while, Portugal and Spain were a single kingdom. In the mid 1500s, there was what was called the Iberian Union, and the royal family of Spain married into or with the royal family of actually, it wasn't even that. Actually, I think it was inherited. Like the king of Portugal died, and then the Spanish royal family claimed Portugal based off of some weird family genealogy. And so they technically, I think, inherited it, something like that. Basically, they were run by the same royal family for about 100 years. And so during that period, there was not really competition per se in South America between them. But then later on, Portugal had a revolution and they were able to regain their independence under some new dude. I don't remember his name. But the Portuguese Empire then became a rival of the Spanish Empire. And at that point, they started fighting more over territory and competing for territory, especially in South America. And so that competition for land kind of defined relations up until the 1800s, uh, even after it became independent. Brazil became independent in like the early 1800s, but even after that, they were still kind of competing with some of the other countries. Argentina is like the big one. That's like the real South American rivalry. Like Brazil versus Argentina has been the big major South American rivalry for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the mid 1800s, I think they were primarily competing over Uruguay, if memory serves. I think Dagnip is in chat. Maybe he can confirm that. But as I recall, there was a lot of fighting over Uruguay and the fate thereof.
Mm-hmm.
Although weirdly, there was also the one war against Paraguay. Like Paraguay is a really small country, but they managed to build up their military. They invested in infrastructure, the economy, and they were able to generate enough foreign revenue to buy a whole bunch of military equipment and import trainers, and they actually built up one of, if not the largest standing army in South America in the late 1800s. And then they just went to war with everybody. They just invaded everybody. They wanted access to the sea. They demanded it from, I want to say Argentina or something like that, or maybe it was Uruguay. I don't remember. This was like the War of the Triple Alliance. If anybody's interested in actually reading about this. But the country they made the demands to rejected it, so Paraguay invaded them, and then I think it was Brazil or something didn't want to give the Paraguayan army rite of passage. That is to say, they didn't want to allow the Paraguayan army to march through their territory so they could wage war against the country they were already at war with. So then they just declared war on Brazil and then marched through the territory anyway. Hmm. So Paraguay ended up at war with Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, which was a very weird combination of countries to be at war with at that time. Because again, they had all been rivals before that. So Paraguay managed to be so belligerent that they unified everybody against them for this one war for a limited time. I think after that, they went back to being rivals. Yeah, some interesting trivia. That war resulted in the decimation of Paraguay. I think something like some ridiculously large percentage of the population died because they didn't just stop fighting. They didn't stop fighting after the army had been defeated. Like they formed guerrilla bands in the countryside of Paraguay to fight against the occupation army. And the result was a series of counterinsurgency operations that just had an increasingly deadly toll on the civilian population. And it was just awful. I mean, something like a majority of the male population died as a result of that. And Paraguay's demographics didn't recover like fully until just generations later. South American history is interesting. You don't hear about it much, but they've definitely had their fair share of eventful stuff to talk about.
So they were in a pretty strong position then, but then they basically threw away their advantage by being overly aggressive to everybody, which got everyone to unite against them. Bit off more than they can chew, kind of.
Effectively, that's what it was. Because even though Brazil and Argentina were rivals and were competing over Uruguay, neither of the elites in either country were that interested in having a strong centralized government or a strong standing army. You know, it was kind of like in the United States back in the 1800s, where we were very decentralized and we had a lot of powerful local elites who wanted to keep it that way so they could preserve their own local power. So the competition was almost like a gentleman's agreement, you know, kind of a gentleman's competition. They were competing, but they weren't trying too hard, such that they might threaten the status quo. But Paraguay didn't give a shit about any of that. You know, Paraguay was run by a de facto dictator who consolidated control and built a very strong centralized government in Paraguay and went about building what was probably one of the strongest bureaucracies and civil services in the region. That's not necessarily that surprising if you know the history of Paraguay. You know, that is to say, it wasn't just down to personality. There actually were pre-existing factors there that actually contributed to that because Paraguay's history is super unique. Like most of Brazil was settled by explorers, basically. I mean, technically, it was settled by captains. You know, there was like a whole shit ton of captaincies back in the 1500s that comprised early colonial Brazil, but almost all of them failed. You know, Brazil was very tropical in terms of climate, and white people didn't do so good in tropical climates back in the day. So it was not very hospitable. You know, in some cases, the captains that were awarded their territories in Brazil never even traveled there. They just didn't even want to go in the first place. It was not considered very valuable territory for a very long time. And as a result, it took much longer to colonize Brazil than other territories in South America. And Argentina was kind of similar. You know, the territory was much more attractive, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of gold or other high profile goods that you could turn a quick profit on there. You know, the best resource in Argentina for a long time was basically just the soil. You know, it was very productive and fertile soil. I think they call it the Pampas, Los Pampas, or some such. It's like a big fertile plain in the center and eastern part of Argentina. But it took a long time for enough people to move there to really take advantage of that. So initially, the biggest industry in Argentina was just smuggling, specifically smuggling gold that had been mined in Peru. That gold was supposed to go north to the ports by which the treasure fleets, Spanish treasure fleets, would pick it up and then transport it across the Atlantic Ocean. But, you know, oversight was pretty limited, especially in a territory as big as South America. So no small amount of pilfering happened, and a lot of the gold that was correspondingly smuggled out of Peru would go south through Argentina and then would be loaded onto merchant ships in what was then Buenos Aires, or what would become Buenos Aires anyway, and then would be sent abroad for, whatever reason. So they were very much frontier territories for a long time, but they were mostly settled just by opportunists, explorers, what have you. It's more complicated than that, but I'm just simplifying so I can focus on Paraguay. Paraguay, by contrast, was settled mostly by Jesuits, Jesuit missionaries. South American Native Americans were largely wiped out, by disease and war and whatnot. But Jesuit missionaries actually managed to get to what is now Paraguay well before some of the conquistadors and Brazilian traders, slavers, what have you. What do they call banderantes? They call them that in Brazil, I think. Conquistadors and banderantes. Uh, the Jesuit missionaries kind of outpaced them and were able to settle Paraguay before them. And when I say settle, what I mean is not that they set up farms or set up colonies. Rather, what they did is they set up missions. And these missions sort of acted as de facto communes, by which what remained of the native population were centralized under the control of the Jesuit priests. And the result is that governance in Paraguay was radically different from very early on. In other areas, it was dominated by, like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, it was more about local elites owning large tracts of land and then explorers penetrating deep into the unexplored territories to get slaves or to try to what's the word I want? Speculate on gold mines or that kind of thing. And Paraguay, by contrast, well, the political economy that emerged in places like Brazil and Argentina was correspondingly decentralized. So Paraguay's political economy evolved out of the missions, and because they were inherently more centralized, the political economy in Paraguay ended up being more centralized. And so that kind of explains how Paraguay's state building took a much more centralizing approach in the mid 1800s than their neighboring states. Like even after the Jesuits had kind of lost some of their influence over the course of, the 1800s and stuff, they'd kind of laid the groundwork for the political culture and political economy in the country even after. So the result is that it was easier for, I think his name was Lopez. The dictator in question was named Lopez. It was easier for a guy like Lopez to come to power in the 1800s and then start building a strong centralized state because the elites in Paraguay were just categorically different than those in neighboring states. They were not nearly so opposed to the prospect of a centralized state. And the result is that he was able to build a strong centralized state that was able to consolidate state control, invest in infrastructure, and invest in economic projects that were able to build up the economy in a way that allowed the Paraguayan state to start investing in things like the military. Now, it was actually the son of that dictator who did all of that state building, who ended up starting the wars. Like his son was like more of a militant nationalist, and he believed that Paraguay, because it had such a strong state and a strong standing army, kind of almost had a right in order to establish itself as a major power by taking territory and gaining access to the sea such that it could have a port. And that kind of led him to the course that he ended up going on, which was to try to invade and conquer I think it was the Rio de la Plata that he was kind of after, something in that area. But obviously, he just grossly overestimated his ability. That is to say, grossly overestimated the ability of his army to manage that. And the result was just disaster for Paraguay. And Paraguay just hasn't been the same ever since. But, going back to the initial settlement of Paraguay by missionaries and missions, one of the legacies of that is that the Native American language in Paraguay is actually much stronger in terms of the degree to which it's survived over the centuries than corresponding Native American languages in neighboring states. And I don't know how it's pronounced. It's spelled like Guarani. but that is actually one of the official languages of Paraguay. I think most people still speak Spanish, but there's still a lot of people that speak Guarani, and I think it is actually taught as a second language in school, which is unusual for South America. A lot of Native Americans or a lot of Native American languages are not taught in school as a viable second language, but I think in Paraguay it's actually mandatory. So that's
Gautani is what Chad is saying.
oh, is that what? Okay, Guatani.
Gautani.
Oh, Gautani. Thank you.
Why do you think it survived more than other native
Oh,
languages?
because one of the things that the Jesuits did in any given territory that they went to was to try to understand the local culture and speak to the natives in their own language, because they believed that was the best approach by which to proselytize them into Christianity. Other Christian orders kind of took a more militant approach. They believed that it was better to be coercive, like to condition people in need, to condition support to people in need on conversion to Christianity, or to just use violence. You know, what is it? Inquisition style violence, basically. But the Jesuits were generally one of the more peaceful orders in that regard. They preferred to try to meet people where they were and try to peacefully proselytize. And the result is that there was an effort by the Jesuits to create a written language for the, what is it, Gautani, I guess, the Gautani peoples of Paraguay. And so the result is that the language was preserved, not only, orally, but also in written form. And that allowed the language to stay much more, to have more staying power, because the government, the powers that be, the Spanish powers that be, were not nearly as assimilationist in Paraguay as they were in other areas where, either the natives were wiped out explicitly or where they were forcibly converted into Christianity in a way that assimilated them into Spanish culture to the detriment of the local culture.
I went ahead and looked up who the Jesuits were, because that wasn't off the top of my head really obvious. It's a order of Roman Catholic priests and teachers and missionaries, and that's one of the things that distinguishes them from just regular priests. Is the Jesuits were more focused on teaching and doing mission work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had a big presence in the Americas, as a result of Spanish rule. And they kind of competed with other orders. I think the other major one was the Franciscans, the Franciscan order. And they kind of had different ideas about, how the colonies should be managed and whatnot. One of the big issues in 1500 Spain regarded the poor treatment of natives by the colonizers in New Spain, sort of in the colonized territories in the New World. And the King of Spain actually ordered a big debate between, different relevant parties in order to kind of hash out the ethics of it, to try to see, what the right thing to do was. And as I recall, maybe I'm not remembering the details right, but I think the Jesuits were one of the ones that spoke out in favor of the natives and argued that they were being treated terribly by the conquistadors and their descendants, and that the encomiendas were, slavery and everything but name, and that there was torture and all manner of rights abuses, and that something needed to be done about it. And I think the Franciscans kind of took the opposite side, that, whatever abuses were taking place were worth it in order to ensure that the Christian conversions that had taken place over the previous decades were not reversed by some kind of resurgence in native religion. Mm-hmm. That's probably a gross simplification of the debate. I'm sure there were other elements at play and other people who participated, but I just kind of bring it up as an example of who the Jesuits were, in that sort of universe at that time. Mm-hmm. In the world of Spanish dominance, in which Spain was a major empire and controlled most of the Americas, the Jesuits were one of the major players in the New World, in so much as they, as a religious order, had influence with local government and with the Spanish crown.
Yeah, so a more universalist Christian group, and more kind of flexible and compassionate to local traditions.
Relatively speaking, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why Paraguay is so weird and unique. They they were disproportionately influenced in their early going by Jesuit missions rather than, conquistadors or colonizers of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess we were talking before about, well, I was mentioning that how weird South America's relations are between its respective countries, and that was kind of a tangent off of Brazil and its relations with other countries. So yeah, like Brazil has had strange relations with its sort of Spanish counterparts because historically they've been rivals.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't really until you get to the 20th century when that really changes. I think historically they haven't even really considered themselves Latino. Like Brazilians, as I understand it, do not consider themselves Latino. They consider Latinos to be Spanish-speaking peoples of the Americas, but not Brazilians, which can be a little weird when they come to the United States. Because for the United States, if you're south of the Rio Grande border, then you're basically Latino.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of ignorant about what goes on south of the Rio Grande, so everything south of that is just sort of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Brazil very much wants to be kind of a regional hegemon to a degree, or at least a regional power. But as you mentioned, one of the major inhibiting factors is the fact that they have not historically had great relations with the rest of the region. And also, they've also kind of kept a distance from the rest of South America as well. They have tried little things like the South American Union, and I think there was another one, Mercosur, is that what it was? Something like that. They have these little international groups that they try, but a lot of them don't really make much progress because a lot of countries there don't really like, kind of like the United States, they don't like giving up sovereignty. They prefer to kind of protect their markets, protect their political systems, etc. So exposure is kind of difficult. Opening things up is kind of difficult within the context of politics there.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some progress in that regard. I think there was finally a freeway that was constructed connecting the east coast of South America with the west coast. But that's like a recent thing. I think that was only like 10, 20 years ago that they did that. A lot of South America is very undeveloped. I think people would be surprised to realize just how undeveloped a lot of the interior of South America is. Because for a long time, people were kind of stuck on the coasts. Because in North America, a lot of the coasts are like beaches or natural harbors or what have you. So North America was much more accessible as a result. In the mountains, what few there were generally low-lying, and it made it relatively easy to penetrate into the interior. And that doesn't even get into all the rivers and whatnot that allowed easy transportation in and out of the interior. So over the course of the 1800s, American settlers were able to go very, very deep into North America very, very quickly by comparison. But in South America, the coasts are actually very hilly and mountainous, and there's actually an escarpment along a good chunk of it, which is just like a giant sheer cliff. So, if ever there's a barrier to stop somebody whose only form of transportation is a wagon, it's an escarpment. So that made it very difficult to penetrate into the interior, even just from the coast. But even beyond that, it was pretty difficult because building roads and infrastructure and whatnot was very expensive, and a lot of the governments there didn't really have the money or didn't have the political will to do that. And as a result, infrastructure has been relatively underdeveloped in South America ever since, like even up till today. Like one of the big things China has done in order to build influence is just helping with infrastructure because there's such a glaring need for it.
Mm-hmm.
Things like dams, railroads, whatnot. But yeah, not God, I'm bad. Something is wrong with my brain. I just lose my train of thought so quickly these days.
Well, we're meandering around, and that's fine. If we were trying to get a really bullet point approach, then that could be a thing. Look at the chat. The chat says, "Keep going, history daddy." See that? Jesuits are hardcore. Their behavior in places like Japan are interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, yeah, the Jesuit. I think there was like a YouTube video or something I saw about that. Yeah, the Jesuits were definitely hangers on. the Japanese government became increasingly repressive as far as Christians in Japan. And they kicked out a lot, but the Jesuits kind of hung on there and ended up bearing the brunt of the subsequent crackdowns. Christianity had been growing relatively quickly in Japan, I think in the like early 1600s, and then the Japanese government was like, no, we're not doing that. And then they just killed most of them. Christianity hasn't been able to really gain a lot of ground since then.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong deterrent, just killing them.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, they were kind of trolly too. That is to say, the Jesuits and the missionaries. They would. I remember one thing I remember from the video is that they started encouraging children in order to kind of get them to convert and also to encourage people who had already been converted. They encouraged them to destroy Buddhist structures, like little statues and other religious things like that, temples and whatnot. They encouraged children to go out and burn them or otherwise desecrate them.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Gonna make little vandals out of them, damn.
Yeah, so it's not like they did not instigate on their end either. There was definitely some very, very controversial stuff that they did that helped catalyze the Japanese government's response in the 1600s.
Mm.
So I'm not going to say they had it coming, but they definitely did some stuff that did not help their cause there.
Yeah. Well, swaying the minds of other people's children is going to piss off the parents, let alone encouraging them to perform arson and vandalism to sacred sites.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll definitely get you the wrong kind of attention. And
Yeah.
it did.
And that also kind of goes back into the point where we were saying, oh, the Jesuits were more of the nicer forms of missionaries. And it's like, yeah, relative to the other missionaries.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
they're still,
relatively speaking.
they're still rustling some jimmies for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an old tactic, though. I mean, if you want to proselytize, be it a religion or an ideology, or anything else for that matter, children are a good target.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily an ethical target, mind you, but it's an effective target because they're easy to manipulate. I mean, some children are very smart, but in general, children are just kind of baseline dumb, like ignorant, malleable. You can kind of tell them whatever you want.
Well,
And so long as no,
they haven't basically learned the tools to be skeptical of other people's opinions, and they also haven't really entrenched themselves in any worldview that they have a really strong and major stake in. That's something that I was thinking about when I was evaluating my religious beliefs, kind of around the time that we were friends, but I had mostly gone through that when I met you. But I was thinking about talking with people about their faith and how the longer someone has been a part of a faith, the more time they've invested in that. So they want to more so protect it the longer they've invested in it than if they haven't invested much in it at all. So for me, I was a teenager to a young adult who was trying to figure out the world and what the truth is and that kind of a thing. So I didn't have like kids that I was raising that I was then invested in what is their religious upbringing. That wasn't really a thing for me. I had much fewer chips at the table of my beliefs compared to someone who's, say, in their 40s or 50s and they had been that religion their whole life. So yeah, it raises a bunch of interesting questions of, okay, yeah, if you're trying to sway minds and win people to your side, the younger they are, the less they have at stake for their existing beliefs. But at the same time, we consider a lot of these major life choices to be something that adults should make, and kids don't quite have the equipment to know when they're being duped or kind of brought into a cult kind of a thing. Yeah, they're very suggestible.
very much so. And you can see that today because some of, if not most of, the most passionate ideologues in the US are teenagers. And there's just a whole range of stuff, political opinions and whatnot, that you can get as a teenager that you really couldn't get in previous generations. Like politics is much more accessible now to people of younger ages than before, just because of the internet. And it's much easier for radical ideas to spread on account of that. I've heard people complain, mostly from the right, about, professors in colleges brainwashing kids. They teach them these sort of radical leftist ideas in college. And if it weren't for that, then things would be different. But that's not really true because a lot of the most ideological people in college are people who had already been radicalized before they came to college. Like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people in high school, a lot of people become politically conscious in high school. Like speaking from my own experience, when I was in high school, my group of friends were very into politics, and we'd already been reading a lot of radical stuff even before we got to college. So by the time we were there, like we were already involved ideologically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also true for college. Like it's not really the professors that radicalize people. I mean, I'm sure there are some that try or that say controversial things, but I don't think college kids become radical because of professors. I think they do it on their own. They're effectively what you might call self-taught. So I think that whole issue is kind of wrong-headed. Kids are quite willing and, if not eager, to embrace radical politics because frequently children, well, maybe not children, but teenagers anyway, are very passionate. They got all the hormones and the testosterone and the adrenaline. They got all of that going for them, and at the same time, they've got their whole future ahead of them, and they're more willing to take risks because they don't have as much invested in the status quo. So they're basically the ideal revolutionaries in a lot of ways, and it's no surprise then that student protests are often the progenitors of broader protests in most societies. They've got the time, they've got the inclination, and they've got the reckless disregard for their own safety. They're willing to do that.
Yeah.
So very easy to radicalize them then because they're inherently attracted to those ideas. And it's not just about change either. It's not just about their desire to make a better world or whatnot. It's also to a degree about the adventure, the ego of it, being the one who changes things, standing up to the status quo, which is being defended by people they often perceive as small-minded and lazy. These older generations just weren't as brave or intelligent as we are. If only they knew what we know, then things would be different. So if we just stand up, we can tear down this whole edifice and
Mm-hmm.
replace it with something better. So there's not a little bit of hubris involved with teenage activism as well. That's really a big part of activism at the younger, lower levels, grassroots activism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just inherently attractive to younger people who tend to be more ambitious and more desirous of building a name for themselves and kind of showing up other people. It's basically just natural human behavior almost. But if you know that and you're older, you can totally manipulate the shit out of that. You can just tell them exactly what they want to hear and just manipulate them, just play like playing a fiddle. Like it's just that easy. Like experienced political operators cater messaging to that demographic, and it's a very easy demographic to get riled up with messaging and propaganda and all manner of political malfeasance of one sort or another. If you want an example, you can go on to most any social media site. For Facebook, it's more conservatives, but Reddit tends to lean heavily younger and is therefore generally more left wing.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's not to say Reddit doesn't always have interesting commentary that can be insightful, but there's a lot of it that is just hacky. And that just the fact that people get so riled up in the comments, those people, I can almost guarantee you, are disproportionately younger.
Yeah,
And that's done on purpose.
I'm thinking about it in terms of like a general lifespan development of humans and how you basically have a really high level of flexibility intellectually when you're in your teenage years and your early 20s where you're open to ideas, but at the same time you have a ton of fire of realizing, wow, society and the world has a ton of problems to it. Why are these problems existing for so long? Well, goddamn, we better fix it. And they have that gumption and that like headlong thrust in the direction of like wanting to do something about the situation or stand for something. Maybe maybe they're defending traditional beliefs and that kind of thing. But it's the older generations that more or less control the flow of information because they control the education system that the young people are growing up in. They control like the media, all this kind of stuff. So it's difficult, I think, for young people to rally around each other and coordinate in a really good way because the people who are older, they understand how the system works, and they've also been sobered and jaded by just how stubborn people are and how hard it is to change stuff. So I think as people get older, they calm down a little bit and they're like, okay, well, it would be nice to change this, and this, but due to how difficult it is to change any one thing, you've basically got to pick your issue and then drive hard in that direction, and maybe a little something happens. But yeah, for someone who's 19 to 21, that's when you feel that like chosen one energy of this is the generation we're going to fix this like big overarching issue. But I would guess that that's been happening for all of human history and probably prehistory, where the young people are the ones pushing for the change. The older people are pushing for stability to make sure the whole system doesn't collapse. And it's that tug of war that is always happening between the generations.
Yeah. And the demographic transition that came with the Industrial Revolution had the effect of rapid population growth, which caused the demographic pyramid to skew heavily towards younger populations amongst countries that were experiencing economic development.
Mm-hmm.
So no surprise then that the 1800s and the 20th century were especially volatile periods, right? Because they were disproportionately younger and therefore more volatile. Since then, the demographic pyramid has evened out, and that's corresponded with a period that's probably more characterized with a certain amount of stagnation or deadlock,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably a more comfortable equilibrium for the older folks than what was happening before. It's also worth mentioning, too, that the Industrial Revolution brought mass production of information. You know, the printing press wasn't part of the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution did allow mass printing of books, making them cheap and relatively available to common people.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also mass communication that came with radio, television, and then, of course, later on, the internet. So the 19th century on basically saw the creation of what effectively became a kind of perpetual motion machine for radicalization of the youth. All of these new innovations allowed the spread of information that was particularly attractive towards the youth, especially in developed countries that were, becoming more developed and had more access to education. And with each new era of technological innovation, those ideas were able to spread more rapidly amongst the youth. And correspondingly, you got more and more unrest. The internet was supposed to do that, and for a while it kind of did not look like it would. But then the 20 teens happened, and it became apparent that it actually was having that effect. It was just kind of a delayed effect because most people did not have ready access to the internet until the 20 teens, which is when you saw the introduction of smartphone technology.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, anybody with a phone in their pocket can get on the internet. That was not true before. And so the effect of the internet we're really only seeing now. The interesting thing for me as a casual observer is seeing how much of the culture, just the broader culture in the West, has come to be so heavily influenced by what I would have called 10 years ago internet culture. Right? The internet had its own distinct culture, like as of 10 years ago, thereabouts. And if you were alive back then and involved in it, you kind of know it. Like you probably remember the beats of it. But it was separate and distinctive from mainstream culture, such as it was. There was some cross-pollination, but by and large, they were separate worlds. But since then, there's been a lot more merging between those two worlds. And it's been really interesting to watch how similar the offline world is becoming to that online world that I kind of grew up with. It's very surreal. But that all plays into radicalization of the youth, that all of that information spreads more rapidly than ever before, and there's more people with more money and access to it than there ever was before. And the result is that we have whole new generations that have whole new perspectives and want to do things very differently than their predecessors ever did.
Mm-hmm.
And it remains to be seen just what kinds of unrest and demands for change will fall out from that. We may have gotten a taste of that in 2020 with the 2020 protests, which happened not only in the United States, but lots of other places. But that remains to be seen. The 2020 protests kind of felt a little aimless to me. Like they had the one thing that they were protesting over. In the United States, it was mostly George Floyd, but then later on, police and whatnot. But at the same time, none of that felt particularly realistic. And in the years since then, a lot of the stuff that they were trying to get has either been reversed or watered down.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like we really have not hit critical mass as far as the social impact that the internet could have and is going to have. And
Hmm.
I think when we do, it'll definitely be very, very disruptive. And I think 2020 was just a kind of a sideshow in that regard.
Hmm.
I think we're in for very interesting times yet, which is saying something, given how interesting the times already are.
Yep, with the rapidly increasing pace in technological development and how lifestyle for people changes and information consumption changes, we're going to have even more changes. So look forward to changes, good changes, bad changes, and medium changes.
Very much so. Well, I'm sure you want to kind of hit the road here since it's so late. I did want to ask, why do you have so many people from Taiwan watching? Because I was looking at the flags and I noticed we have 8 now. There was 9 before, and I think that's the highest I've ever seen it.
Yeah, so Taiwan actually has a very strong StarCraft block of people. They have their own server. So if
Uh-huh.
you switch over to the Asia server, we'll just do that real quick on stream. They have two places where you can host games. One is Korea, one is Taiwan. So they're very much integrated and they have their own space. China has their own server as well, but Taiwan server is connected to the Korea server. So if I get a map here and I say I want to create a lobby, Korea, I have 204 milliseconds, and I can also just host a server on Taiwan. So Taiwan has quite a few really strong StarCraft pro gamers. So I guess their gaming scene is just relatively really strong. StarCraft viewership. We also got a raid from Beowulf, who is a caster. So that was 380 viewers from that raid. And maybe chat can tell me if there was a player from Taiwan who was playing. Maybe they were cheering for them. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. That makes sense. That's a good explanation.
Yeah, one of the most famous players who's kind of become a little bit of a meme is Haas, and he's famous for cheesing the crap out of people. He does lots of cannon rushes and unorthodox, aggressive builds and stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and link you that in Discord just for some silly entertainment.
Oh,
Nice
thank you.
username, made a really funny video called When I'm Haas. Here we go. I'll link it in the Twitch chat as well. But yeah, now you
Well,
know
hello
why
to,
Taiwan has a strong StarCraft scene.
yeah, well, hello to everybody from Taiwan listening, and thank you for participating in our little thing here.
Yeah, and as we've mentioned before, we're not experts in everything. And if you're from a country that we talked about and we got something wrong, please correct us. And also, if you're just from a country and maybe we haven't mentioned you for a little bit and you've got something cool going on, let us know in the YouTube comments or in chat, because he reads the Twitch chat after we do this and then reads the YouTube comments in the VOD. So
Thank you
tell us
for
what's up.
uploading those.
Yeah, no problem. We're just two Americans trying to figure out what's going on, so obviously it's not going to be the most even take on things.
Yeah, we try. Yeah, I noticed we had some Chileans. What is it? Three? No, no, that's a different. Two. Here we go. Two Chileans.
Mm.
Did we talk about the new constitution?
We did a little bit, yeah. Are they still working on that?
No, they finalized it and they put it up for a vote, and the vote actually failed.
What?
Yeah, so there's not going to be a new constitution in Chile.
Oh, they're just going to scrap the whole thing then?
No. I mean, well, yeah, they're going to scrap the new one that they wrote up.
Huh.
Yeah, there was apparently a lot of controversy over some of the more lefty elements of it, which were seen as a little too much of a reach.
Mm-hmm.
I had some notes on it. I guess I won't go into all the details now since we're wrapping up, but yeah, that might be something we try to talk about next time because I thought that was pretty interesting. You know, the way that it was designed, some of the specific elements of it, it was very, very progressive, but apparently that put off a lot of people.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Got
one of
some.
the tricky things about actually pushing something through is you want to shoot a little bit more for the middle than you might go for just for yourself.
Yeah. Well, I don't blame the Constitutional Convention for that because when they had the vote to elect constitutional representatives in the assembly, the result was disproportionately lefty in nature, like relatively more leftists, you know, broadly speaking. That's a very broad umbrella term, but relatively more leftists won seats in the Constitutional Assembly than people on the right. So people kind of knew from the start that the Constitution that would be written would be relatively lefty in nature. So that wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was actually still surprising given that the vote was more lefty in nature that the Constitution they wrote ended up getting rejected. You would have thought that the referendum on the Constitution would reflect the vote for the Constitutional Assembly, but it did not. Yeah, kind of weird. Well, let's see. We've got some French people, sweet, lots of Europeans. It's lots of people in. What is it tonight? 462. Wow.
Yeah, we're
That's
rocking it,
kind of
dude.
that's kind of the upper bound for what we usually get.
Yep.
Got somebody from Ukraine listening, hopefully not too traumatized by the commentary.
I have been getting some updates from Bitter Sugar.
Oh, cool. How's he doing?
Yeah, he's hanging in there. I think I mentioned last week that the area where their property is in eastern Ukraine, it was taken by Russia and then retaken by Ukraine, but they can't move in yet because it's still like pretty close to the front line and it's also mined. So
Yeah.
that kind of pointed to a bigger picture thing too, which is after the war is all done and stuff, there's going to be a pretty long period of reconstruction of just trying to make the places livable. Like whatever was destroyed by the war is going to have to be rebuilt and stuff. So that's going to be its own phase that we'll no doubt talk about.
Ah, he was looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Let's see. We also had, who else was it? Lots of Swedes, 16. I guess if you're from Sweden listening, my question for you would be, what do you think of the new government? Because I knew they just had a new conservative government win power.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was supposed to be some far right elements. I'm a little behind on my reading, so I didn't get the in-depth explanation on that. But I think there is like some far right people who were supposed to have been in the new coalition. I think that was partly a result of immigration as an issue, that is to say. It's kind of a big deal in Sweden. I don't know who's listening from Macau, but thank you. It's the first time I've seen Macau's flag on here. Flags are always fun.
Hell
Well,
yeah.
I had one question too before I go. Have you been watching any of the new Star Trek stuff that's come out past couple years?
I have not. You're talking about like Lower Decks?
Lower Decks, Discovery, Picard. I think those are the main ones.
So my partner is a Trekkie and she's super into all of that.
Oh,
So I
cool.
can pass along the question. Why have you been watching it?
I had not been watching it for a long time, but the past couple weeks I got a Paramount Plus account and have been trying to blitz through and catch up as best I can.
Hmm.
So I actually watched Star Trek Nemesis, which was a movie that came out 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's been on my to watch list ever since. So I finally got that off the list. So then I followed that up with Picard,
Mm-hmm.
both seasons that have been released thus far. And then I followed, God help me, Discovery,
Mm-hmm.
which was quite the adventure. 4 seasons of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I started Lower Decks recently, so I'm working my way through that.
Nice.
So quite a bit, yeah. It's a lot to take in, but that's generally how I do media these days at this stage of my life, apparently.
I
But yeah,
don't I don't blame you because with the like subscription services, you want to make sure you get value from that, and you don't want to juggle too many where you can't watch their library and you feel like you're just blowing money on it.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of new ones out, so I figured I'd finally just kind of dive in and try to get caught up. And interesting. It's a mixed bag, and I've noticed I've kind of gone online for the first time in a long time to see what the fan community kind of thinks of all the new stuff, and apparently there's a lot of debate. I
Dude,
wasn't expecting
I've been
quite so
ranting.
much.
I've been ranting about this regarding the Lord of the Rings show. So Rings of
Oh yeah.
Power, it's on Prime. I love it. Don't go to the Reddits. Jeez Louise. Like I'll watch an episode and I'll be like, yeah, that was fun. Man, I'm happy with how this is turning out. And you go to the subreddit for it and then it's just screeching and anger and vitriol. They're just so pissed off and it's like, I don't even think this helps me at all. People are so mad about TV shows right now. People, yes, TV shows have flaws in them. You don't need to like throw a fit for every episode. Let people enjoy some stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Well,
concur.
if you haven't seen The Rings of Power still, I would highly recommend it. I'm going to watch another episode of it tonight, but it's really good. I'll
Rings
see
of
what's up
Power.
with the Star Trek stuff eventually, I'm guessing.
So I assume that I infer rather that you're not a traditional Star Trek fan.
Not really. I'm more Star Wars than Star Trek, but I did see the original Star Trek and I've watched quite a few of the movies. And I've liked what I've seen. It's just like there's so much of it that I don't really know where to go.
Yeah. Well, I'm not like super. I was a kind of a fan, but I was a casual fan. I'm a filthy casual, so I can't comment too much.
Mhm.
But I can kind of give you the brief rundown. Like the original series is very good. That's sort of like the original Holy Trilogy in Star Wars in a sense. So people hold that in high regard, but there's some clunkers there too.
Mhm.
But for my I guess I should say our generation, the next generation is kind of the main Trek.
Mhm.
That's definitely the most accessible one, I think. So if you're looking to kind of get into it with your friend, that's probably a good starting point. Definitely lots of good stuff there. The first couple seasons, not so much. First couple seasons, the show was a little shaky and it took them some time to kind of find their footing, but definitely better in later seasons. If you really want to get into it after that, Deep Space Nine is good, but same thing, kind of took a couple seasons to kind of find the footing and get a good beat going.
Mhm.
The end of Deep Space Nine was very good, in my opinion. They had the Dominion War arc, and I like military history anyway. So as a kid, I was all about that. I really liked that whole story arc, but a lot of people didn't like it. Are you familiar with this debate in Star Trek about like real, authentic Star Trek in terms of like the ideals of Star Trek versus sort of the more action movie, sort of movie studio version? Have you heard
Yeah.
that debate before? Yeah.
Yeah.
So some people didn't like the emphasis on war at the end of Deep Space Nine,
Mhm.
but I kind of took it for what it was. It was a good standalone story. I think it's important for the universe to be respected in terms of the Roddenberry ideals that it was kind of built on, but I also don't mind new types of stories being told within that universe. So
Mhm.
that's always been my compromise with like other IPs that I like. I'm happy to explore other aspects so long as this of a universe, so long as the story is good,
Mhm.
and so long as there is something of the original ideals in there, or at least some stories being told in some other media. I think there should be something for like the hardcore nerdy Star Trek fans,
Yeah.
but I also don't mind the new stories. So DS9 kind of did that. Also, have you ever heard of Babylon 5?
I've heard of it, yes.
DS9 was kind of a ripoff of that. Like
Mhm.
the guy that came up with the idea for Babylon 5 actually went to Paramount first when he was pitching the idea.
Mhm.
And then they turned him down and a couple months later announced Deep Space Nine, which has almost exactly the same plot. So little shenanigans there.
Mhm.
But DS9 definitely holds its own. Babylon 5 is probably better on it. That's probably a controversial take, but overall, Babylon 5 probably had the better story. But
Mhm.
DS9 holds its own too. Voyager is bad, but I still liked it.
Mhm.
I was a fan as a kid. The first three seasons were kind of objectively bad. I actually had not seen the first three seasons until a couple years ago when I just blitzed through them finally, and I was like, yeah, I can totally see why people hated Voyager.
Mhm.
But it got much better after that. It still had some hit or miss after that, but all of the episodes that really focused on the core premise of the show, I feel, were still pretty good. But I wouldn't recommend Voyager unless you're like really, really into it. TNG definitely, maybe DS9 after that, and maybe Voyager if you're just a completionist.
Cool.
And then after that, everything after that is kind of optional, I would argue.
Mhm.
There was a bunch of movies made that of the Next Generation cast, like what was it? Star Trek Generations, First Contact, Insurrection, and then Nemesis.
Mhm.
Um, First Contact is the only one that's, I would argue, good.
Mhm.
Generations is okay, and then the last two, just don't watch them unless you just really want it. The criticism of the last two movies is that they were basically just really long episodes of the normal TNG series, basically long TV episodes.
Mhm.
And I definitely felt that energy. It was because I felt Insurrection was so underwhelming that I did not watch Nemesis until 20 years after it came out. I was so down on the movies at that point that I didn't want to bother.
Mhm.
So yeah, those are not really required viewing. And that kind of takes you into the new era where they have like Star Trek with the reboot. Do you remember that?
Yes. Where it's like the
Yeah.
younger version, everyone's kind of recast, young Spock, young Kirk, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I've seen those.
So those, you probably know those are really controversial within the community, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I won't retread that, but that speaks for itself. That's like a whole separate universe. But the stuff that came after that is technically in universe. Some of it probably should not be, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested in that, and you might be interested in the newer stuff just because it's a little more actiony and it's not quite so much hit or miss TV show stuff with, some of it's really good, but then some of it's bad and some of it's mediocre.
Mm-hmm.
They're a little more watchable with the new stuff. They introduce a lot of really awesome, like special effects. Like even the stuff I didn't like in the new Trek stuff, I really respected it just because of how good it looked. Like that aspect is very accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the writing is the main problem. Like the writing is just so deeply inconsistent. That's the most diplomatic way I can put it.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like season one of Picard is probably the best of the new Trek stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Lower Decks is just a whole separate thing. That's just comedy. I won't even comment on that. But season one Picard, I felt kind of held its own the best. Season one Discovery, I would rank after that, just because the story was more consistent and less batshit insane than the later seasons were.
Mm-hmm.
And I also felt like that story kind of had an interesting film noir element to it. It was like a film noir story set in the Star Trek universe.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I felt about season one Discovery. And that was obviously a big change from normal Roddenberry ideals, but I felt like they executed it well enough to make it a decent story. After that, I don't know, man. Seasons two through four were weird. They went in some weird directions. But at least seasons one, Picard, Discovery, I think those would be worth it. And it might be easier to watch than some of the older stuff.
Nice. Well, I'll let you know what I check out and let me know if you hit up Rings of Power. Chat,
Will do.
All the Voyager fans perked up when you were like, Voyager wasn't that good. They were like, you said what? He said he liked it, to be fair.
I can't win. You can't win as a fan of anything talking about it online.
True.
I said that it's bad largely as a concession to the better part of the community that doesn't like it. I would expect that if I said it was good, then I would get a lot of backlash.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I liked it as a kid, but it was the stuff. I mean, like I said, it was hit or miss, but the good stuff I felt was good enough to keep me invested in the show, and in particular the characters. But there was also a lot of filler material. There was too many time travel stories.
Yeah.
Voyager kind of ruined time travel for me. It's just so random and so unimpactful. Like if you're a writer, a time travel story is what you do when you just want to have drama but without any consequences. Because at the end of the episode, they just come back to their own time and everything just resets and none of it goes anywhere.
Yeah.
So that was kind of meh.
Well, cool.
But yeah, the core premise is... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying we're getting a little Star Trek tour on Agent Smith's, what is it, Paramount Plus is where it is?
Yeah, Paramount Plus.
Yeah.
It's free for the first 7 days, so if you want to try to crank them out over a weekend or something, you could hypothetically get the stuff you really want for free, which is what I tried to do. Didn't quite work, but yeah, it's been a fun ride. But having watched all of that stuff, I was just curious if you had any opinions or thoughts on it.
Not yet, but if I do, I will be sure to let you know.
Gotcha. All right. Sorry for the detour. I know that's off topic, but
I was
curious.
All good. I'm happy to share with my girlfriend that I need to figure out Star Trek stuff so I can get back to you on what's good and what's not.
Best of luck.
Well, take care of yourself, Mr. Agent Smith. Thank you for another amazing episode around the world, and we will see you not next week, but the week after that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Always a privilege. Thank you for having me, and I'll see you next time.
On the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Nice. GG.